to the bitter end because the Trump campaign has sued now in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Georgia, and is pursuing a recount in Wisconsin. It seems pretty clear the Trump campaign is going to contest every last vote. So we might not have sort of we can trust the final outcome until some of these lawsuits are settled or all the dust is settled on the counting.
Mark, after the setbacks for President Trump in Arizona and Wisconsin, does he still have a path forward to being reelected?
The president's campaign would tell you that he does, but it pretty much hinges on flipping the result in Arizona. It's kind of an interesting situation there where you had Fox News call Arizona for Biden early on election night, relatively early, and a lot of the other networks haven't. But the Associated Press, sort of the gold standard that we follow for calling races, did declare Arizona for Biden. So it counts it in his column in the race for 270 electoral votes. But like I said, that vote has been narrowing as the votes from Maricopa County, the largest county in Arizona, come in, and the outstanding mail ballots are counted there. So if Trump manages to flip the outcome in Arizona, that gives him a better path to getting to 270. But he probably includes Pennsylvania, though.
Mark, we're really brilliant. You're dead on the story overnight. Mark Niquette, thank you so much, at the Reading Station, the Philadelphia Convention Center in Pennsylvania. And Mr. Niquette absolutely nails it, folks. Overnight, Arizona very fractionally gave Mr. Trump a little bit of a lift. 68,000, roughly, the disparity there. A real treat. After David Folkerts-Landau on negative interest rates, we speak with Kenneth Rogoff of Harvard, yes, the former head of economic research for the IMF. Professor Rogoff on the nation's debt and deficit. If we have time, Kenneth Rogoff on the experiment of negative interest rates. Please stay with us with futures surging up 64. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
We explore the trends, investments, and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
Their CPG history, their experience, and really how we might be able to combine together to really create this fantastic public company. And so we kind of got into the SPAC thing a little bit before it became such a hot method of going public.
Trump barely won in 2016, right? He won by a total of less than, I think, 90,000 or 100,000 votes, and the margin in Michigan was less than 11,000 votes. So, you know, for a guy who won by razor-thin margins, you know, if Biden wins by razor-thin margins, I think it's going to be a difficult public campaign for Trump to make. And it's unclear what the issues that the Supreme Court would consider.
When we've asked investors what they're most worried about, when we've asked if it's a contested election, what do you think happens to the S&P 500? We've had 50% say, oh, the S&P 500 could go down 5 to 10%. So I just think, you have to let this whole process play out.
Well, that was Wendy Shirley of Brown University and Joyce Chang of JP Morgan on the presidential election. Now, Tom is dealing with a couple of, charts that we need to look at. So joining us now to talk about the markets is Ron Temple. He's Lazard Asset Management co-head of multi-asset and head of U.S. equity. Ron, great to speak to you. The markets are pretty much on a tear, or at least they're liking what they're seeing. Is it relief because we didn't get a big surprise in the U.S. election? Or do they actually like this combination, which could be a possible Biden presidency with a Republican Senate?
I think, thank you, Francine. I think it's largely relief. I think, if you look at the possibility we were looking at coming into the election of a blue wave, in particular a dark blue wave, meaning if the Democrats had won, say, 53 seats in the Senate and the presidency and the House, there was going to be quite a bit of stimulative activity, primarily through infrastructure spending, through climate-related investments, and that would have been very positive for growth. But the cost of that was going to be pretty large tax increases, raising the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28% and raising tax rates on very high income earners substantially. So I think what the market is doing is basically looking at the bright side of the story and saying, first, it looks like Biden is likely to win, and it's unlikely to be a contested election as we wait for the last couple of states. And number two, maybe we get less stimulus, but we also don't get tax increases. And keep in mind that 7 percentage point tax increase could have been about a 10% headwind to S&P earnings.
I look, Ron, at these markets, and there's that huge feeling of a melt-up. We got that in 2016. Is there an equivalency?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would say that we're going to see a melt-up. I do think it's more relief. I mean, net, this is not the best outcome for markets, in my view. I think the better outcome would have been that major fiscal stimulus package. I think largely this is going to end up being a case of legislative gridlock. I do think we will get a COVID relief package, and I think the market is probably attaching some positive view to that prospect. But I think the negative side of this is it means for the next at least 2 years, we're likely to be largely dependent on monetary policy to basically invigorate growth in the U.S. So I think, melt up might be too much of a stretch, but it does seem that this is a market that wants to go up. I mean, we were going up in the run-up. Right. With the idea of a blue wave, now no blue wave, we're still going up.
Well, I got blue wave bruises and I got red wave bruises. I'm flipping back and forth, Ron, between a growth mandate and a value mandate. What's the Lazard mandate right now?
Well, I mean, we're always looking at the best stocks from the bottom up and not trying to have a specific style. So we're always trying to look at what the company's profitability is relative to valuation across most of our strategies. But I do think the environment we're looking at for the next couple of years, unfortunately, I would say looks like one where it's likely to be more of the same. I mean, for the last year, we've seen a 4,200 basis point spread between the Russell 1000 growth index and the Russell 1000 value. So we're literally talking about being up 36% for growth versus -5 and change for value. I think in a rate environment where you have negative real rates and where there's a narrow group of companies generating revenue and earnings growth, investors are likely to continue chasing those growth stocks. And that does become riskier, by the way. If you're paying higher and higher valuation multiples on cash flow that you hope will happen in 5 to 10 years, there's a lot of room for downside.
So, Ron, are you saying that technology stocks, for example, are in bubble territory or that they could soon be in bubble territory?
Yeah, I want to be careful. I think within technology, there are some very well-valued companies, some companies that look attractive from a valuation perspective still, but there are definitely some pockets of the tech sectors that do look like they're in bubble territory. And I do worry about some of those companies. And again, I know it's really nuanced, but I tend to think of it, you've got some really great companies that generate high returns on capital now and are likely to continue doing it for years to come. And I think in many cases, those are still attractively valued. It's more of these kind of buying business plans as opposed to buying businesses that makes me worried in the tech sector. And it's not just tech, I should say. I mean, I think we've seen in biopharma this year some very speculative trading behavior in some of the companies, especially those chasing vaccines. So it's different areas of the market where investors might be overpaying for revenue growth and not actually getting net profit.
Ron, thank you so much. Ronald Temple there, Lazard Asset Management co-head of multi-asset and head of U.S. equity. Now, coming up next, we of course have that conversation. Our Guy Johnson speaking to Andrew Bailey, the Bank of England governor. That's coming up shortly, and this is Bloomberg.
The big concern is climate change. We can see the global warming accelerating at the moment, and the goals that we must hit are so ambitious. It's 1.5 degrees by 2050, being climate neutral in terms of emissions by 2050. That's a huge challenge. We have to reduce emissions by 50%, 2030, 2040 again. It's very, very ambitious, and mobility plays such a crucial role in there. One thing is to do it in developed countries. I think we're going to get there by 2030, but then the rest of the world, and that's just as important. If you look at developing countries, emerging countries, that's where probably the biggest challenge we are going to face, to also deploy EVs there and make mobility greener in those countries. I know it's possible to move mobility forward fast enough to be able to do its part in this fundamental threat that we're facing.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York. We look at U.S. elections and we look at the Bank of England. Now, we had that interview. Our Guy Johnson spoke with the Bank of England governor, and they spoke after the central bank boosted its bond buying program by more than expected. Here's the governor.
I think we've learned this year from our experiences with earlier bouts of COVID that it's important that we act both quickly and that we do act clearly in scale. And that was an important consideration for us. The second thing is that, of course, we have to meet the inflation target sustainably over time. So a lot of the work we did on our forecast and then applying the prospective policy decisions into it, it was clear to us that actually 150 was a quantum of QE that delivered a sustainable path of inflation to meet the target.
What is the economic effect difference between the two numbers?
Well, it's obviously, it's larger, obviously.
Yep.
And I think it really works through two ways. One, of course, is that it does have an impact on the cost of financing and on the curve, the interest rate curve. And secondly, obviously, there's a quantity effect, if you like, which is, it puts more liquidity into the economy. It takes out assets that are not as liquid and puts assets into the economy that can be used in consumption.
I'm placing an order to sell short Canadian dollar. Price I'm looking at 131.264. Okay, put a place to sell short Canadian dollar at 131.264.
What's changed, of course, in recent times is that we've had to look far more at the tools that we have available to us, and there's more choice over tools. Whereas if you go back in time, obviously it was really a choice over rates, actually, interest rates, and what you did. It was a choice over one tool. And we've done that. I mean, we've had to look at the role of forward guidance, we've had to look at the role of quantitative easing, and we are doing the work, obviously, on evaluating whether there would be a case and in what circumstances for using a negative rate. We don't have a sort of fixed order of use of tools, and I think that's appropriate. It would always be dependent upon the state of the world and the state of the economy that we found ourselves in.
Looking at the economy, looking at the report that you've delivered today, questions are going to be asked, as they are being asked around the world, as to whether or not economies are going to suffer double dips. You've got a negative number in for Q4. I think you've got 2.5 in for Q1.
Yes.
What is the risk of the downside on the latter number? What is the risk that that number undershoots?
Well, I think it's a particular issue, of course, about the evolution of COVID itself. We've got a very substantial downside risk on the forecast, and a lot of that relates to how COVID itself is going to evolve. So I would emphasise that. The other thing I would emphasise about the sort of the path of GDP and activity in the economy is just, of course, to bear in mind that at the end of the third quarter, so at the end of September, relative to a level before COVID, so end of last calendar year, the economy was about 9% down in terms of the level of activity. So when we think about the sort of the quarterly path, we have to overlay it on the fact, and these are huge numbers. I mean, you think in history, these are just unprecedented numbers. So that fall in Q4, of course, does come from a starting point that is much lower than it was pre-COVID.
Trajectory is different.
Yeah.
As a result, what do you see the biggest risk now lying ahead for the economy? You've mentioned COVID, but let's talk a little bit about Brexit. What assumptions are you making about Brexit right now? You're going with government guidance. Nevertheless, you have agents that are giving you information as well. What assumptions are you making about the preparedness of the British economy for Brexit come the start of next year?
Yes. So we continue to condition and use in the forecast the view that there will be a trade agreement and that it will be the trade agreement that the government has set out to get. That's, I think, would obviously be an outcome we would all welcome. And we continue to use that because the negotiations and talks are obviously still going on. So, actions speak for themselves.
Governor Bailey, and we are managing the message there. Guy Johnson with that important interview. We'll hear much more about that through the day. We have the first shift in voting in this early morning. It's a tiny shift, but truly telling. In Georgia, and the way I frame this in the dynamics is we have a 7,000 gain for Mr. Biden and a 2,000 gain in votes for Mr. Trump. That delta is obviously 5,000 votes. And in Georgia, Francine, the gap narrows from 23,000 to about 18,000 right now, still with 4% to count.
Yeah, Tom, so just to put it simple, basically Joe Biden needs a win in one or more of these states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, provided that other race calls actually stand. And Trump so far has asked, I believe, a recount in Wisconsin, filed suits in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, and also complained about other various states' procedures, Tom.
We're going to bring these dynamics through you all the morning, all these little attachments to the votes in Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and on to Pennsylvania. A conversation with a gentleman from Harvard coming up next. This is Bloomberg.
Short position open for Canadian dollar at 131.264.
The Census Bureau has asked Congress for a 120 extension. I don't know that you even have to ask, and I think 120 days isn't nearly enough.
Market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Election 2020, thank you so much for joining us in this early American morning. And yes, futures put it on, up 55, now up 71, and perhaps it's that small calculus we saw in Georgia, an adjustment. Mr. Trump still ahead in Georgia, but Mr. Biden gaining nicely here. The gap is down. My brain has forgotten, down to 18,000 between them. That is an ever so slight gap as they count votes in Atlanta. Now a real treat for us. Kenneth Rogoff, of course, has been a huge supporter of our work over the years, the Harvard professor and former head of economic research at the International Monetary Fund. I consider his book, The Curse of Cash, to be the bravest book of economics of certainly the decade, if not of many years beyond that. Ken Rogoff, I want to talk about the curse of two Americas, the partition that this election divides. We seem to get farther and farther and farther apart. What is the policy prescription to bring America together?
Boy, that's a really tough question. I mean, certainly from an economic perspective, we need to have a better social safety net in the United States. I think the COVID-19's really exposed that. But there are broader questions, really big questions, with how to regulate tech, how to regulate tech's control over media, which is, I think, a big contributor to this divisiveness in the country. And you know, whoever is president, certainly seems like it's going to be Joe Biden. This really needs to be something they need to focus their attention on. I think that, to me, is the underlying problem.
The underlying problem is one of productivity, but it is almost the application of the benefits of our economy against almost what we call, Ken, rent seeking, where the elites are literally not stealing it away, but just taking their fair share and then some. How do we switch that tone, that attitude?
Well, I mean, I think there needs to be a better social safety net in the United States. I think that's been really clear for a long time. And at the end of the day, some of this has got to be higher taxes, more government services, more transfers, or if not more government services, more government subsidized private services. I think that would go a long ways towards calming the country down. But I don't know, because you go to, other countries in the world and you certainly see a lot of the same thing. Globalization has made the world more equal. Don't forget that. I mean, Thomas Piketty said it was, it created great inequality, not if you count all citizens of the world the same, but within countries, the benefits, have not been shared equally. There has been study after study showing that the emergence of China in the global economy has been a big contributor to inequality in the United States and Europe. And you have to have, some measure again, to counterbalance that.
What's so important here, Ken, is to understand that Francine Lacroix in London has Piketty over her left shoulder in her shot that we have. I mean, it's very important to understand that Lacroix is totally read in on these matters. Francine?
Professor Rogoff, I'm not sure how to follow that. Professor Rogoff, I mean, the concern is that, some of the prescription that you've just laid out very coherently and very, well put, just is not what the Americans want. Certainly not if the Senate goes to the Republicans. So even if you have a Democratic president, are his hands tied for uniting the country? Are they tied for any kind of social equality going forward?
Well, it's certainly going to be harder to have change, and it's not over yet in the Senate, from my read, that if the Democrats end up getting both of the Georgia seats. But certainly if the Senate had moved, we would see a dramatic change in policy, something very decisive experiment. And now I don't know what, if the Senate stays in Republican hands. Unless one of the Republicans strays. I mean, that their majority is thinning. They lose one person, and suddenly the Democrats can have their way. So, we don't know what lies ahead. I'd like to see, certainly in dealing with the pandemic, for them to do something, because this is a natural catastrophe. They're not debating stimulus. They're debating people dealing with a disaster.
But what does the election, it's so close, right? It's razor thin, no matter really who gets it. What does it tell us about what kind of democracy the Americans want?
Well, I think Americans want the democracy that they have. They want democracy. I'm not sure that this election is showing that democracy isn't working. I'd say just the, contrary, that President Trump has said he won't respect institutions and the rule of law. Looks like he's going to be pushed out anyway, no matter how he tries to resist. The media had, this very one-sided election for reasons we can discuss, with the pollsters, were just way off, by maybe even worse than 2016. The media was way off. And, it shows there's a democracy working. I don't look at this election and say democracy is working.
Ken, I got one final question. This is really important. One of the great moments we've had in our history of doing economics is you and Joe Stiglitz joining us at Davos on the same stage. And of course, this goes back to all the debate ages ago about global and international economics. You know, Ken Rogoff, that you and Joe Stiglitz are on the same page, that getting out of a debt disaster is about the little g. It's about the growth rate. Do you have a confidence that we can generate a U.S. and global economic growth rate that will help us crawl out of this massive debt?
Yeah, so I'm an optimist on global growth. I don't think you can extrapolate long-run trends. I'm an optimist on technology, but we're in the middle of this pandemic, and I'm not an optimist on how that's going. I hear all different views that the second wave will be mild, that it'll be terrible. I tend to lean towards thinking we still have a lot of tough times ahead for people and for the economy. But give it a few years, and I am an optimist on where technology and growth is going.
What does it mean for small and medium-sized enterprises? If we don't have the stimulus needed, and I don't know where, how likely is it that we'll get something enough to keep some of these companies afloat, what will we look at the U.S. economy to be in 2 years from now?
I'd be very clear, I am not optimistic on what's going on right now. It's a disaster for small and medium-sized businesses. It's a disaster for competition. It's a disaster for all the people who've lost their jobs and are having trouble finding things. I'm really talking about the 20-year future of technology. But right now, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. A lot of regions may see double dips. We don't know how the virus is going, but I hear all views. I tend to be still quite concerned. And no, I'm not trying to say there's going to be great growth soon, or certainly the right way of thinking about it is when will we get back to where we started? And it is going to be, I think, at least till the end of 2021, maybe longer.
Ken Rogoff, thank you so much for joining on this historic day for America. Professor Rogoff at Harvard University, I can't say enough about is the curse of cash. So much going on the data front. Futures up 64, and yes, yields have advanced lower yields in the last 10 minutes. With our first word news in New York City, here's Ritika Gupta.
Thanks, Tom. Joe Biden is just one battleground state away from becoming the next president of the United States. Biden already won 2 key prizes in the Midwest, the states of Michigan and Wisconsin. That puts him at just 6 electoral college votes away from the 270 that he needs. His best chance appears to be in Nevada, where he holds a lead over President Trump. And for the president to be reelected, he would have to win all the battleground states that haven't yet been called. President Trump's team is pursuing a contradictory legal strategy. The president is trying to stop vote counting in states where he's ahead, but he's demanding counting or recounting where he's losing to Biden. The president has repeatedly claimed that there's widespread fraud in voting by mail. The tightly contested election is putting more pressure on the Federal Reserve to support the economy. Policymakers are not expected to announce a shift today when they conclude their 2-day meeting. But Chair Jerome Powell may hint at coming changes to the Fed's bond buying program. Chances of aggressive fiscal spending for households and businesses faded when a Democratic sweep didn't happen. That record-setting $35 billion IPO by Ant Group reportedly will be delayed by at least 6 months. That's according to the Financial Times. Ant was supposed to begin listing its shares in Hong Kong and Shanghai today, but earlier this week, Chinese regulators put that offering on hold. Global News 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Ritika Gupta, thank you so much. This is important today. At 2 p.m., there is a Fed meeting. Scott Minerd of Guggenheim Partners scheduled to be with us. It'll be most interesting on the election front. Okay, maybe the Fed meeting's off the radar, but it is always important to our global Wall Street audience. Scott Minerd at 2 p.m. Futures up 63. Stay with us. Election 2020. This is Bloomberg.
I'm placing a stop on profit for Canadian dollar at 131.262. Sorry, 242. Okay.
Very unusual times and enormous difficulties getting groups of people to agree on things.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters in the City of London, join us on Leaders with Lacqua. You'll have to produce less beer in 2021?
No, I don't think so. I think consumers will find a way. But I mean, if there are restrictions, but consumers, of course, are smart and they'll learn to live with those restrictions, I think some occasions will migrate.
is Bloomberg.
Good morning worldwide from London and New York. Francine Lacroix and Tom Keene. Election 2020 on a Thursday is election 2020 because it is most historic. Lots of other news going on, but certainly with futures up 68, the VIX slamming in from a 40 to 26.75. There's some form of optimism in the Bloomberg world as we look at the uncounted across too many states. Our first briefing of the morning with our Kevin Cirilli, our chief Washington correspondent. Kevin, in Georgia, the first numbers, the first nuance of the morning, moving from 23,000 gap. Mr. Biden catching up now only 18,000 votes away. Can Mr. Biden catch Mr. Trump in Georgia? And what are the ramifications across this morning in Atlanta?
Well, look, I think that should Biden eke out a win in Georgia, then without question, he would be on path to exceed the only 6 more electoral votes that he needs in order to clinch the 270. We likely should get some new data today from Clark County, Nevada. Nevada also still hanging in the ballot, so to speak. So from that front, I would anticipate some new data from Nevada, 6 electoral votes. If Biden wins that, he gets to.
I'm moving further my stop and profit for Canadian dollar to 131 to 14. Okay, it's moved 131 to 14.
Yesterday at the Philadelphia Convention Center as Trump supporters, including one of his sons, really became rather vocal. I
and
believe
Giuliani.
Mr. Giuliani was there, still recovering from our interview with him a week ago. Kevin, you know, the president's language, he claims Pennsylvania. Now, long ago, Francine and I and John and Lisa, we claimed Kevin Cirilli. What is the language of claim? How does anyone claim a state?
Well, you know, look, I'm not sure precisely like what the word claim means, to be honest, because it doesn't have legal standing. And so I think from a broader standpoint, if they are going to pursue legal action, it would have to go likely to the Supreme Court. But the nuance here is what they would likely file suit over and what would make it to the Supreme Court. And that is that ballots that are postmarked on Election Day that would not be able to be counted for 3 days in the 3-day window that had been granted by law to Pennsylvanians. And so it's an incredibly nuanced argument, but it's an argument that the Supreme Court did not take up on October 28th, Tom. That said, there's a major change on the Supreme Court, and that is the addition of Judge Amy Coney Barrett. They didn't take up the case, and they also provided some wiggle room that they would be able to take up the case. But the question becomes, will the case even matter if Biden wins in Nevada and Georgia?
Kevin, there's something that I've been trying to really, or at least I've been thinking about almost all morning. So, Joe Biden needs to win in 1 more state. You were explaining it very clearly, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, provided that the other race calls stand. What are the chances that the other race calls don't stand?
Well, I think so when I talked to Trump campaign sources within the last 24 hours, according to those sources, they have their eye on Arizona, which they feel would be somehow able to switch. It would have to pull a Florida circa 2000, where it would have to be recalled all the way back to flip. I mean, it's been called for Democrats, and now they feel that additional votes would come in and bring it back to their count. I think what's remarkable, though, here is that Americans were prepped for a long election battle, but that doesn't mean that they don't have election fatigue. And so every day and hour, really, that goes by, and as these votes are counted, ultimately this election will end.
And one of the newspapers coming in here this morning, this is the Daily News, a little bit thinner than it used to be, but nevertheless the wonderful Daily News with Shockwave, and look who's on the cover, the former Vice President, Mr. Trump, down here, and we'll see if those photos reverse in the next coming days. Kevin Cirilli, thank you so much. I got about 8 more questions. We'll get that through the morning. Francine, this is exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting, Tom. So we track, of course, COVID-19. We track the U.S. elections. So there are 3 main stories, right? We look at extra lockdowns in Europe today. They're starting in the U.K. today. We look at the number of infections in the U.S. and the impact it has on the markets. It's all about, though, the U.S. election, and that, as you know, it's razor thin. It's really to the wire. Again, we need to look at recalls, and we're talking about thousands of votes in certain districts that could make or break either candidate. And then we look at the Bank of England with that great interview that Guy Johnson did of Governor Bailey. Also coming up in the next hour, actually shortly, and then in the next hour, COVID-19, Johns Hopkins University nursing professor Jason Farley will be talking about vaccines. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg.
Women leaders were actually better at controlling the deaths from COVID-19. Do you think out of this pandemic, we'll see more countries be willing to elect female leaders?
When we look at women leaders, we tend to project on them baggage that they shouldn't bear.
Women are given an opportunity when no one else wants to do the job.
Women had a very clear objective. They wanted to save lives.
The women leaders, if you look at their careers, have also built up a level of trust.
In fact, women have to be better at communication in order to be elected as leaders, whereas this doesn't hold true for men.
We need to get those sexist stereotypes out of our head and give women a fair run for leadership.
Trying to change the stereotypes about women is not only the business of women, but men have to be part of it.
Welcome to That's Debatable, an interactive series on today's most pressing issues. The resolution this time, is a U.S.-China space race good for humanity? We'll hear from both sides.
The competition, if you look at the past, led to innovation.
A whole new arms race could start.
And we'll get your perspective too. Help from the artificial intelligence of IBM Watson. I'm John Donvan. Join us for That's Debatable, presented by Bloomberg and Intelligence Squared, Friday on Bloomberg Television.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York. Now, as we continue tracking COVID-19, Bloomberg has developed a unique partnership with the leading authority on coronavirus. Johns Hopkins has been at the forefront of the international response, and every day we bring you insight from experts in public health, infectious disease, and emergency preparedness. Well, joining us today is Jason Farley. He's Johns Hopkins nursing professor. Thank you so much, Professor Farley, for joining us. A lot to talk about, and we need to start with exactly what we know in the U.S. is a rising number of cases, a rising number of people getting infected. Is this wave, the second wave, or the continuation of the first wave, less deadly than the first, or are we going to see the number of people in hospital significantly rise in the next 2 weeks?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we are seeing increases in mortality, but we have to still think about the epidemiology of COVID-19 shifting somewhat. So In our prior waves, we really had concentrated epidemics in Florida and in New York and California, and in sites where there was really large academic medical centers bringing in additional resources. There was surge capacity better than the rural epidemic that we're now beginning to see. And so as we move into more rural states, we are seeing hospital surge capacity be tighter. There's less options for that surge capacity, less ICU beds, fewer ventilators. And so all of that may contribute to excess mortality. On the flip side, we also have, some benefits with the therapeutics. So with steroids as well as dexamethasone, which gives a therapeutic benefit, although do not completely prevent death. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword here. We are seeing progress. At the same time, surge capacity is not as good as it was previously.
Jason, how different are COVID policies going to be nationwide if we have President Biden in the White House?
Well, first, I think, it sounds like it's still too early to tell, but if under a Biden administration, my understanding based on their plans that they've reported, they would be providing a much more scientific approach, which will include more measures similar to what's going through in the UK, possibly a series of necessary lockdowns, possibly a series of added measures in terms of requirements for mask wearing, again, allowing the states to really adjudicate those rules and regulations. But I also think communicating to the American people both the severity of the illness as well as the important measures that we all need to, we all really need to get behind. I think the mixed messaging from the Trump administration has sowed confusion and it sowed doubt about the importance of the epidemic. And I think that's one of the most important things that the Biden administration would change.
Yeah. Jason Farley, you also took a first dose of the COVID-19 vaccine yesterday. What was it like?
So yes, I enrolled in the AstraZeneca vaccine. It was the most conveniently available to me at Johns Hopkins at the time, the one we were enrolling in. The vaccine is classic kind of approach to all vaccines. It's an injection. You have to get 2 doses for this particular vaccine. Just a little muscle soreness in the arm. Of course, it was an injection, but outside of that, slight headache the next morning, and just some general muscle aches. Some Tylenol completely cleared that up, or paracetamol completely cleared that up. And feeling fine today, reporting symptoms from the vaccine every single day, feeling great. Hopefully we'll get the second dose in about 28 more days now.
Jason, thank you so much. Jason Farley there of Johns Hopkins, and be sure to check out VRUS Go on the Bloomberg terminal for the latest information. Now, of course, we continue following the U.S. election. We continue following the various states that are still counting. And then a piece of breaking news. This is from the BBC, but we are expecting the Chancellor of the Exchequer to talk shortly. And we understand through the BBC that he will extend the furlough program until March.
Ada 3 kelompok pengungsi tersebut yang sudah berpencar arah. Kemudian kami dari Polsek Banda Sakti berkoordinasi dengan perangkat desa Kampung Jomblang melakukan upaya pengumpulan secara persuasif serta minta tolong kepada warga. Alhamdulillah warga yang terpecah semuanya berkumpul.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
Is the real key here, and what the market wants to see is something that is orderly.
We could be still living in this uncertain environment around the stimulus for a while.
The biggest downside risk is that we get divided government and gridlock.
The Senate is even more important. That's where fiscal stimulus comes into play. That's where taxes come into play.
The consumer is very nervous.
The longer the uncertainty, the more the stimulus talk is going to be delayed. People are going to worry about growth again.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
From New York and London for our audience worldwide, good morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance live on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz. I'm Jonathan Farrow. This equity market is flying on the S&P 500, on the NASDAQ. Tom Keene, it is Thursday morning. For many of us, it is Tuesday night still.
It's Tuesday night still in the election. We'll get to that in a moment, John. I think the markets are so important for our global Wall Street audience. It's real important to look at the levels here and not the abrupt changes day after day. Just moments ago, S&P futures 3,500, Dow level 28,000 plus, NASDAQ 100 level 12,000. John, that's a market that's adjusting.
And this is a market on fire, Tom Keene. The NASDAQ up 9% since election day. 3 days, NASDAQ futures up 9%, Tom. Can you make sense of some of this price action?
Absolutely
I know we can
not.
find nice little neat narratives, but to see the equity market up this much is pretty impressive.
You know, we can pontificate about it. Lisa will have all the answers on, the why we're moving up so much. But, John, look at the yield market. Just in the last hour, yields come in. I will note, John, that of all the political debate this morning, the one little tea leaf was in Georgia. Mr. Biden narrows the gap with 96% counted.
You mentioned the bond market, a yield curve flatter for a second straight session. Lisa Abramowitz, the counting continues.
I will say, if you want a neat narrative, and John, you can make fun of it and tell me that it's wrong, and it probably is. But I will say that the narrative of the day is that the Fed is going to have to provide more support to this economy because fiscal stimulus isn't going to be there in the size that people had expected because of a split government. We will get to all of that, but that seems to be the presiding narrative, and that is good for big tech. Talking of the election, talking of Georgia, Tom Keene, Georgia is expected to give an update around 10:30 a.m. today Eastern, possibly before when the Secretary of State is expected to speak. Nevada also expected to update its tally, which has been frozen since yesterday, possibly at noon or after that. These are the key states. If Biden wins either of these, it will put him over the 270 or at the 270 mark for electoral votes. He is currently at 264 versus the 214 of President Trump. 8:30 a.m. we've all forgotten about it. We actually get U.S. initial jobless claims, the economy. They are expected to come in a little bit lower than yesterday, but still 735,000 additional claims expected to be filed. Still incredibly high, given the fact that we are supposed to be recovering. 2:30 p.m., there's also a Fed meeting, which everyone seems to have forgotten about. Fed Chair Jay Powell is speaking after that 2 p.m. policy decision. John, really interesting to see. First of all, he won't weigh in on the election, but what will be the criteria for them amping up the potential stimulus and fiscal and the monetary response to problems in the economy?
The Bank of England making their move early this morning. This is the next 2 hours on Bloomberg Surveillance. I'll go through the markets, and Lisa will tell you why we're here. Here's a snapshot of things this morning. Good morning to you all. Equity futures with a big bounce this Thursday again, up 58 on the S&P. We advance even more than that on the NASDAQ. And the FX market just unleashed some dollar weakness in the last 24 hours, some really pronounced dollar weakness at that. Euro-dollar reclaiming a 118 handle. And in the bond market, this curve is flatter. Yields lower yesterday, lower again this morning, down 2 or 3 basis points to 0.7362%. That's the story of the price action. Much more on that in a moment. We wake up Thursday morning once again to the same headlines. The counting continues. In many ways, a contrast of two candidates on the campaign trail, and very much so still in the aftermath. This was Vice President Joe Biden urging calm.
After a long night of counting, it's clear that we're winning enough states to reach 270 electoral votes needed to win the presidency. I'm not here to declare that we've won, but I am here to report when the count is finished, we believe we will be the winners.
The president didn't front the cameras yesterday, but was tweeting, including this tweet right here. We have claimed for electoral vote purposes the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which won't allow legal observers, the state of Georgia and the state of North Carolina, each one of which has a big Trump lead. Additionally, we hereby claim the state of Michigan. In fact, there was a large number of secretly dumped ballots, as has been widely reported. Now, here's the snag here, Tom. Twitter actually flagged the last part of that tweet as potentially misleading under its election security efforts, and this has been an ongoing story now for the last couple of days.
It has been, and of course that had a huge acclaim yesterday as he claimed Pennsylvania and selected other states as well. We're going to get right to it now with markets on the move and time so compressed across all of this historic morning. Kevin Cirilli joins us, our Bloomberg Chief Washington correspondent. Kevin, I got about 8 ways to go right now, but I'm going to end up with your Pennsylvania. Are you waiting for Pennsylvania, or will we not get there?
It might not come down to Pennsylvania, to be quite frank with you. I think that when Clark County in Nevada reports their ballots, that could really... That's, 6 electoral votes right there. That could push Joe Biden to 270. Then you mentioned Georgia, where the president does still have a razor-thin lead there. But that also potentially, Atlanta and the suburbs around Atlanta could potentially push Joe Biden over the edge. Look, in terms of what I heard from my sources yesterday on the president's reelection campaign, this is what they feel is their path to 270, which is increasingly becoming more narrow. One, that they would have to get a reversal of sorts in a state like Arizona, where they feel that there are additional votes that will be counted that will trend in their direction. And secondly, that the votes that were cast on Election Day and are able to be counted by law up until 3 days after Election Day, tomorrow, that they not be ultimately counted. They feel that they have a legal case they would be able to make their case to the Supreme Court. However, this story is quickly evolving. I think Lisa just laid it out in terms of the timeline. I've got my eye on the next 2.5 hours on Georgia, and then by noon, Nevada. So it could be a very interesting day where you have Joe Biden reaching 270 in the electoral count and no word from President Trump, or we could have major moments for both.
I mean, Kevin, it's important. And Kevin, I need to identify for you on radio and television that what you heard from Lisa Abramowitz was what we call a neat narrative. John, what I would notice here very importantly is Arizona is really open to debate. Some news organizations are saying Arizona is for Mr. Biden, and I'm going to be direct, John. Others aren't, and that's why you see a confusion over where the electoral votes are right now.
As you can see, we close position on Canadian dollar right here. Yep. price 131,214. Okay, so how long it took us? Less than an hour to make a profit from our trade.
Specifically to me, and she then went on to tell me, and this was on the record but off camera, that she said that it would be very difficult for the president to win if he didn't carry Arizona. And so Arizona, Maricopa County, I think our Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributor, of course, the former campaign manager of John McCain of Arizona, 2008 campaign. I mean, he went on and laid it out flatly about just Maricopa County and how that is essentially the swing county, so to speak, the purple county of this state. And the president played well outside of that area, but he really took a political gamble that he might be paying the price for if the spread in Maricopa is still what it is. That's the suburbs, the swing voters of that state.
Kevin Cirilli, thank you so much for being with us here in an early morning, and I'm sure we'll hear more from Mr. Cirilli, our chief Washington correspondent, through this day. Futures up 59. Right now joining us, David Balin. He is with Citigroup, their global head of investments. David, I want to cut to the chase and take from your note. You focus on gridlock. Is the gridlock forward than the different than the gridlock of recent years?
Well, in terms of economic policy, Tom, probably not. I mean, what we're going to see, I think, is some level of stimulus package. It won't be what it would have been, had there been a 100% control by the Democrats, but there will be a package. And if you think about the trifecta from a stock market standpoint, you have the Fed, holding rates very low for the next 2.5 years. You've got some level of stimulus in January, and perhaps most importantly, you have 4 different vaccines that could basically be announced between the end of November and January, and they're being made in hundreds of millions of doses by each of the companies. The combination of knowing that there would be an end to the pandemic in 2021, stimulus in the market sometime in January, and a known who the president is quite a bolus of news that can propel the market higher. And I believe that that's a combination of those things that's actually happening right now.
The market,
although I'm not really confident in the nature of this rally.
Well, yeah, and that's where I wanted to go, David. The market is not a monolith, and right now what we're seeing is a doubling down on the growth stocks and the tech stocks and not the reflation trade that people have been hoping for. The neat narrative that we were talking about is the Fed is going to have to provide more support. Rates are going to stay low. Necessarily, we're not going to get that faster growth from a higher fiscal support package. Is the neat narrative correct, or are we going to get that stimulus in the form of just economic growth and recovery as the vaccine gets implemented?
Yeah, I think that narrative is actually wrong. We'll talk a little bit about the rotation too, but the reason that the narrative is wrong is that you've got an enormous sort of tailwind here. You've got basically between 12 and 15% of the global economy shut down in terms of travel, leisure, retail, education, healthcare, all of it shut down. You take a look at consumer demand in the United States, it's higher than it was in December of 2019 before we turned that back on. So there's quite a bit of a tailwind in that way, and also in terms of the actual amount of velocity of money, which will actually take place when everyone leaves their house. And that's where you get to this whole rotation of the market. It's shocking to me that the NASDAQ is up this way, but that is the defensive trade. Rates down, technology up. And that's what tells me that people actually are still scared. Once we see that change, I think that'll be indicative of what will happen over the next couple of years as the regular market comes to bear.
David, great to catch you up, sir. As always, David Balin there of Citigroup. You heard that there, Tom. The defensive nature of the equity market move. Hard to get your hands around when you see the NASDAQ and the S&P up as much as they are, but there is a defensive tilt to the equity story.
Well, yeah, absolutely, John, and you've seen it with yields coming in as well. You can look at any of the yields, and frankly, John, you can look at the yields in Europe as well. Beneath the radar, the German 10-year is really at a difficult time. So it is odd. Equities up as yields come down.
From London and New York this morning, good morning. It is the longest Tuesday night ever. It's Thursday morning. Good morning to you all. Equity futures are rallying alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz. I'm Jonathan Ferro. Heard on Bloomberg Radio, seen on Bloomberg TV. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
With the First Word News, I'm Rishka Gupta. Joe Biden is just one battleground state away from becoming the next president of the United States. Biden already won 2 key prizes in the Midwest, the states of Michigan and Wisconsin, and that puts him at just 6 electoral college votes away from that 270 that he needs. His best chance appears to be in Nevada, where he holds a lead over President Trump. For the president to be re-elected, he would have to win all the battleground states that haven't yet been called. The tightly contested election is putting more pressure on the Federal Reserve to support the economy. Policymakers are not expected to announce a shift today when they conclude their 2-day meeting, but Chair Jerome Powell may hint at coming changes to the Fed's bond buying program. Chances of aggressive fiscal spending for households and businesses faded when a Democratic sweep didn't happen. And new lockdown regulations take effect in England today. They'll enforce the closing of pubs, gyms and non-essential shops. Household mixing also will be restricted. Parliament gave its blessing to the new rules after Prime Minister Boris Johnson warned that England faces the, quote, risk of mortality on a grievous scale. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Riska Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
I'm David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here?
It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
Americans yesterday once again proved that democracy is the heartbeat of this nation. Just as it has been the heartbeat of this nation for 2 centuries. And even in the face of a pandemic, more Americans voted this election than ever before in American history. And if we had any doubts, we shouldn't have any longer about a government of, by, and for the people. It's very much alive in America. Here, the people rule.
Former Vice President Joe Biden speaking in Delaware. From London and New York this morning, good morning. The counting continues into Thursday morning. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Bravitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro, live on Bloomberg TV and radio. Here's a snapshot of the price action. Equity futures up big over the last 3 days on the NASDAQ, up 9%. On the S&P, we're up 1.8% on the session. In the FX market, dollar weakness the story. Just bear in mind this. The information we have is this race is still too close to call. This market is trading on the anticipation that you will have a Biden White House. That is not what we're suggesting. That is just what this market is trading on, especially the weaker dollar story. Off the back of that, look to China. The euro stronger this morning. The Chinese currency has been on a tear over the last week or so. Relatively speaking, of course, for comparison's sake, China, Tom, doesn't often go on a tear. That currency has been strong.
I'm so glad you mentioned it. Just because of time, I haven't featured it, but it's 6.61. The Chinese yuan is miles away, a trans-Pacific miles away from 7 yuan per dollar. I want to bring this note up, and then Mr. Biden has almost 72 million votes, 71.956 million votes. He is 2.5 percentage points ahead of the president's popular vote of 68.3 million. And I guess that's a Biden victory if we see it, and that's just speculation, and we'll have to see how the vote works out. What we do know is there were thoughts of a blue wave. We've had a number of analyst guests who've been very strong about, well, maybe not. No one has been more vocal about the lack of a blue wave than Terrence Haynes. Terry Haynes is with Pangea Policy, and we are thrilled that he joins us this morning because he absolutely nailed what is beneath the headlines. Terry, in what way did the blue wave fail?
I think the blue wave failed, frankly, Tom, because it's a classic example of people talking themselves into what they wanted to believe, combined with poor supporting information to back it up. There is an underestimation, as you can see from the election results, of just how much support there is for President Trump, but beyond that, how much support there is for Republicans generally, firstly, and secondly, for a lot of the dozen unknowns that I was pointing out in the last couple of weeks before the election, including the potential effects of things like lockdown effects in battlegrounds and the effects of constant civil unrest and the effects of crime in a variety of cities. People want what they want, and the country is certainly well divided. But these people believe what they believe, and they're coming out to back it up. So I think people ought to take away from this that don't talk yourself into the coastal narrative, because that's not where it is.
Terry, it's really important to talk about turnout. Turnout was huge, and over the last 4 years, the Democrats just assumed that the bigger the turnout, the more it would play into their hands. And Terry, that didn't happen. What's the lesson from that?
The lesson from that is that it is very simply that Democrats have an awfully long way to go to bridge and reach the centrists and people living in the heartland, principally. The other argument I would give you, frankly, is that Republicans have a very long way to go before they reach the coasts. The narratives have been built over the past 20, 30 years to be so different that any candidate or candidates that want to bridge across that is going to have to start thinking outside the box and not relying on the lazy narratives that have built up, and try to figure out new ways, practical ways to get across that gap, actually excite people about what's going to go on, but more importantly, deal with their economic circumstances, because that's not being dealt with by politicians.
Terry,
on either way.
Terry, that's the future. I want to talk about the present, which is the assumption, as John and Tom were talking about, that Joe Biden will become the next president. That is the assumption baked into markets, not what we are saying. Terry, there is a feeling that Arizona is already for Biden. It's already in the bag. It's been called for him. And yet there is a lot of question about this, certainly with so many votes not yet counted. Do you think that the call was too early, calling Arizona for Biden?
Do I think so? Yeah. For one reason only. No disrespect to anybody that made that call. But there were clearly lots and lots of votes out there that hadn't been counted. And I think Arizona, broadly speaking, was treated very differently than, say, Pennsylvania or Michigan, where similar sorts of numbers were out there, and you knew that there were still lots and lots of votes remaining, and yet the networks at AP didn't call those states early, while they did call Arizona, and I think that was a problem.
Terry, we got a short answer here because we have massive breaking news. But Terry Haynes, I've just got to ask, what did you learn about Florida?
What I learned about Florida, I didn't learn anything about Florida, frankly. I thought that that vote would come out pretty much the way it did, and never tried to shove socialism down the throat of people that fled from it. How about that?
Terry Haynes of Fangio Policy.
Somehow I knew
Terry,
I'd
quite a
get that
strong
answer.
finish there. Terry, thank you very much. I've got to say, Terry pushed back against those polls so much over the last couple of months. Terry, thank you, sir. What is happening in the United Kingdom right now is everything Chairman Powell would like to see, but won't happen in the United States. Earlier this morning, the Bank of England increased its QE, its bond buying program. They brought that meeting forward because Chancellor Sunak was making the address that he is making right now. And the news that comes from that is Chancellor Sunak is extending the furlough wage support program to March. This is the government paying 80% of wages for those that have to stay at home on furlough as the United Kingdom, England, goes into lockdown today. And Tom, this is the sequencing that I think is so important. The Bank of England and the Chancellor are in lockstep. It is almost orchestrated perfectly. The Bank of England makes its move, more bond buying. The Chancellor comes out and extends the wage support into March. More debt, who's buying it? The Bank of England. That's a delicate dance. What's happening in the United States today? The chairman of the Federal Reserve will go into that news conference and plead for more fiscal support. Who's going to answer that prayer, Tom?
We have no framework here, John, that I can see of March 2021. I was stunned when I saw that headline. And I'll just tell you, John, yes, we're distracted by an election, but after this election, whomever wins, are we in any way looking out to March of 2021? There's no way I see that.
We're trying to get to Friday and maybe hear from Pennsylvania, Tom, in the next 24 hours and get a vote tally there in the United States. But this is the story in the UK. There's a lockdown for a month into early December and a chancellor that's providing wage support out to March 2021. From London and New York this morning, good morning to you all. The voting continues. Our coverage will continue on Bloomberg Radio and TV. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
opportunity knocks at the door, don't say, blimey, I've still got my pajamas on. Say yes to stuff and it will take you interesting places.
We're clearly going through some very unusual times and, enormous difficulties getting groups of people to agree on things.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters in the City of London, join us on Leaders with Lacroix.
Valuations, particularly, sort of technology landscape, have gotten to some pretty extraordinary levels. So I think it's not a surprise. I don't think it's any indication of the beginning of the end, but I do think markets don't like uncertainty.
For our audience worldwide, this is Bloomberg Surveillance Live on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Bravitz. I'm Jonathan Ferro. 2 hours away from the opening bell this Thursday morning. Good morning to you all. It's a race that is still too close to call. It comes down to a handful of states: Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, maybe even Arizona. Equity futures up 62 points on the S&P 500. We advance 1.83%. The NASDAQ absolutely flying. In foreign exchange, euro dollar 118.28. Mention the Chinese currency. Dollar China lower for 6 straight days. That is strong, strong, strong Chinese currency. In a bond market, yields lower yesterday, curve flatter, bull flattener. That's the story again this morning. Yields down another 2 basis points, Tom, to 0.7429. What a turnaround in the bond market. In about 48 hours from near 1% down to 74 basis points on a 10-year.
Yeah, the 10-year yield, I measured it this morning. I can be honest, folks, I don't have the number in my head right now, but it's roughly a 3.5 for standard deviation move from a higher yield to that 0.7429 that we're at right now. And I will say the Bloomberg screen, just the blinky red and green, is way more active right now than it was 24 hours ago. Futures up 63. Emily Wilkins is used to the marble halls of Capitol Hill, and that, of course, is territory for the gentleman from Delaware. Right now, she's ensconced in Wilmington, Delaware, with Mr. Biden and his team. Emily, what is the plan this morning for the gentleman from Delaware?
The plan is to keep waiting and remain calm. The Biden campaign is looking for results today to potentially come from Nevada. They are also keeping an eye on Pennsylvania as well as Georgia. At this point, if Biden's lead in Arizona holds, a victory in any one of those states will hand him the 270 electoral votes he needs and the next presidency of the United States.
Emily, everyone's focusing on the presidential race and sort of when we're going to get an answer there, but everyone seems to assume that the Senate will remain in Republican control. Is that true?
It's not a bad assumption, but there is still a narrow chance that Democrats can pull off a 50-50 Senate next year, which would give them the upper hand if they win the White House. What we are looking at right now is Georgia. Georgia has 2 Senate races going on. We're waiting to see if one of them, between David Perdue and Jon Ossoff, goes into runoff territory. That's if Perdue falls to less than 50% of the vote. The other one, we already know it's going to be a runoff. That was given a long time ago. We're not going to know the results of that till January. So once again, the theme today seems to be patience. We're just going to have to wait a little bit to see how this all pans out.
Just want to jump into the market very quickly, guys, and take a look at the FX market. The dollar index, the Bloomberg dollar index, a much broader measure of the US dollar. Session lows down 0.8%, the lowest since May 2018. Tom Keene, that dollar weakness has really started to flush through the FX market in the last 24 hours, largely on the anticipation from the market's perspective that you get a Biden White House and a more predictable, maybe easier, softer foreign policy approach with not just Europe, but also with China as well, which speaks to that Chinese strength, that Chinese currency strength we've seen in the past couple of days too.
And for the majors, the gamma here, the acceleration is really exceptional. I'm looking down at the terminal. We're about ready to get a 103 handle on yen, 104.00 stronger yen. But relative, John, the euro is more stronger than yen, with that pair euro-yen breaching 123, 123.09. There's dynamics there, John, between China and between the major pairs as well.
Yeah, I'd pick up South Korea as well, just a fantastic proxy, not just for global growth, but for global trade. And trade's the story here. Tom, I know at this point it's too early to really extrapolate out things too much. Votes are still being counted, but market participants are in the business of doing exactly that. And the conversation is around that predictability, around the trade story. And if you do have a divided government, as the president has demonstrated over the past 4 years, Tom, what you can do once you have a divided government is that you can do things with trade. You can do things on trade without Congress. That's really important. And that may be a lever that this president, whoever that might be, will be pulling. This market right now, Tom, assumes that that person is Joe Biden.
There's no question about that. And again, the correlation's tighter here than they were 24 hours ago. We'll keep you up to date with that. Emily Wilkins, thank you so much with the Biden camp in Wilmington. We have not heard from the Trump camp this morning, I believe. Right now, we do hear from Wells Fargo and their head of macro strategy, Michael Schumacher, joins us. He's just thrilled he could lend his voice this morning. Michael, you've got such a broad reach. I'm going to dare an open question. What is Michael Schumacher looking at here at 7:34 Wall Street time?
Yeah, Tom, what we're looking at is pretty simple. We think the blue wave is being priced out of the market. It's probably a mistake. We think it was overpriced prior to Election Day. Now it's probably being underpriced. We just heard the discussion about both Georgia elections potentially going to runoff, and that puts the blue wave back in play. And yet, as you all have mentioned, we've got the 10-year yield down to 74 basis points now. So with equities ripping, it's really been an incredible move. And we think some of that's uncertainty, if you will, is going to come back. And as markets start to think more about the possibility of, maybe there's at least a sliver of a chance it goes 50-50 in the Senate, and perhaps Joe Biden wins the presidency. What does that all mean for markets? Well, it's not good for the bond market if that happens. So we think the move's been too extreme.
So, Mike, do you think that's a trade you want to make or a trade you just want no part of right now? The 10-year yield at 74 basis points, do you want to lean against that move or just sit on the sidelines?
I think you sit on the sidelines, John. And the reason is that there's another trade out there, or another scenario, if you will, which is the extended delay. So the 2,000 redux, that's bad. So that's just an all-around rally in the bond market. That's risk off. And you can see the lawyers getting all fired up right now. We kind of knew that would happen. So I think at this point, you want to wait that one.
Mike Schumacher there of Wells Fargo, just a little bit of disruption on that line at the moment. Mike, we're going to let that go. Lisa, let's talk about the bond market. Bid came through in a huge way yesterday. This market caught wrong-footed after the massive amount of steepening we had Monday into Tuesday. We have the flattener back on. What did you think of what Mike had to say?
Yeah, I think that it's very interesting talking about how long-term this might be the wrong play, that yields may go higher, especially if there is more of a contention with respect to who has control over the Senate. But right now, I think if you look at, for example, five-year break-even contracts, which is what I'm doing right now, they've contracted dramatically in the past 2 days. I mean, basically now we're pricing in a 1.7% inflation rate over the next 5 to 10 years from a high recently of nearly 2% at 1.9%. I'm looking at this and thinking to myself, this is the trade, and yet we are still going to get a vaccine, right? I mean, I'm not sure exactly what people are pricing in here. I think really we're going to find out from the Federal Reserve today how willing they will be to backstop debt markets through the turmoil.
Well, I think you're right to talk about the sequencing. Rick Reeder of BlackRock was on our network yesterday talking about exactly that. This market can only deal with one thing at any given time. We're dealing with what's right in front of us, counting, and the counting continues for the election. After that, Tom, you've got to talk about what's happening elsewhere. COVID-19, the shape of the cycle, the trajectory of the recovery going into 2021.
Yes, Greek lockdown today. I believe it's for 3 months. Can't remember right now. The stunning news out of the UK on a March continuance here. John, what I would note, and George Saravello's publishing moments ago at Deutsche Bank, it's like, John, it's scary. Saravello's channels Pharaoh. I mean, that's what's going on. And George is talking about the growth outperformance of the Pacific Rim. He's long Australia. He's long EM. And there's a growthiness here that folds right into election 2020.
That comes right out of China as well, Tom. China speaks to that story. The recovery has been much better there. Some people assume it's more secure. I believe Mike Schumacher's back with us, and we've secured that line. He joins us from Wells Fargo. Mike, just speak to that. As we move past the election, the other issues on the horizon, sir, your thoughts on them? I believe we've lost that line again. Mike Schumacher of Wells Fargo is not going to be with us at all. Mike, if you can hear me, sir, my apologies. I'll take the blame for everything. Tom, let's pick up on the equity market. Growth outperforming the equity market, that's for sure. The NASDAQ absolutely flying over the last couple of days. And when you compare it to the Russell, the NASDAQ up 3.85% yesterday. The Russell was flat. And that's the story of the last couple of months, Tom. The Russell has outperformed. Tech's really struggled. Yesterday, for some people, was just clearing event risk. And once you get past that, Tom, you fade some of the moves we've seen. Elevated vol, tech underperformance. You just reverse it all.
You know, bring up the VIX if you can, Riley. We do this, folks. We do the charts. We do everything here on radio and TV in real time. Riley, bring up the VIX, the equity market index, and bring, you know, we're got like a 5-day chart, 7-day chart, whatever's a neat narrative for Lisa. And John, what's so important is the VIX was a 40. What, the last time you and I had a beverage? And now we're down to 26.54. We have seen a ginormous taking out of uncertainty.
In a big way, Lisa. We faded that. Many people thought we'd get this big contested election, and they priced in huge steepness of the volatility curve going into the back end of the year. It was really elevated going into December. They're pricing that out. I wonder, Lisa, given what's playing out before our eyes right now, the tight races, some people have called Arizona, some people haven't. We're talking about a handful of votes maybe in places like Nevada to decide this thing. Lisa, I wonder if this market had it right 2 months ago when it was talking about this election process going on and on and on for several weeks.
Well, it will go on, and I think that the question is, are people too sanguine, too complacent about the potential for volatility? John, the one takeaway this week in my mind really is the Fed, and I know the focus is on the election, but because there is the absence of a blue wave that people were expecting, we really are looking at a bet on the Fed backstopping markets. You're talking about the Russell 2000, for example, the idea that it's underperformed dramatically, and yet if you look in credit markets, there's been an incredible rally. CCC rated debt, the lowest of the junk, actually seeing yields come in the most to the lowest since 2018. This is not a bet on growth. This is a bet on the Federal Reserve backstopping the credit markets because nobody else will. And the consequences of that, if right, are significant, John. And if wrong, people are going to lose a lot of money.
The extra pressure on the Federal Reserve a little bit later. The extra pressure on Tom Keene. Tom, are you doing a Fed special today?
We're doing a Fed special. Never has it been more off the radar. But, John, I think it will actually be very nuanced because of the actions we see in your United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, I mean, with all the uproar, and I read it in the British press and the great work our Brexit team's doing in London, John, at least there's a plan or an attempt at a plan. With our non-federalism, we don't have a plan.
Can we put this on the radar, just briefly, that you're doing a Fed special on Mrs. Keene's birthday? Are you in a bit of trouble for that?
I am so, it is, John, it's just...
Do you want to make it up to her now? Do you want to wish your dear wife a happy birthday?
In here. It is, it's her birthday today, and the heritage is different. Well, the birthday with me, it's like, you know, John, here's some tot tickets.
Wait, Tom,
you know.
Tom, John is giving you an opening to make it up to him. Just wish her happy birthday.
Just... wish your wife a happy birthday, Tom. You've got this. Come on.
I wish her a happy birthday.
Come on.
John, usually, you know, like I throw her some Tots tickets or whatever, a 6-pack or whatever.
The romance.
Within the culture, the birthday is a 30-day celebration. It's bracketed around 15 days before and 15 days
You're nailing
after.
it, Tom. Nailing
it. It's a birthday-a-thon. Every day is a birthday.
If you see Tom on Bloomberg TV, hear him on Bloomberg Radio through the next 48 hours non-stop. There's a good reason for it. He wasn't allowed home.
Coming
Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa
Dolce
Bravitz,
Gabbana.
I'm
The
Jonathan
markets.
Ferro. The eyes of the world on Washington, D.C. and New York. This market's flying up 60 on the S&P. We advance 1.76%. This is Bloomberg.
With the first word news, I'm Ritika Gupta. Joe Biden is on the brink of taking the White House after wins in Michigan and Wisconsin. Biden now is just 6 electoral college votes shy of the 270 he needs to win. His best chance may be Nevada, where he holds a lead over President Trump. The president's campaign is suing in Michigan and Pennsylvania to stop vote counts that have been trending towards Biden. The president could still be re-elected, but he would have to win all the battleground states that have not yet been called. And it's a grim milestone in the coronavirus pandemic. Daily deaths and new infections have set global records. Yesterday, it was reported that more than 10,000 people died from the disease, and the number of people reporting infections passed 600,000 in a day for the first time. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
Women leaders were actually better at controlling the deaths from COVID-19. Do you think out of this pandemic, we'll see more countries be willing to elect female leaders?
When we look at women leaders, we tend to project on them baggage that they shouldn't bear.
Women are given an opportunity when no one else wants to do the job.
Women had a very clear objective. They wanted to save lives.
The women leaders, if you look at their careers, have also built up a level of trust.
In fact, women have to be better at communication in order to be elected as leaders, whereas this doesn't hold true for men.
We need to get those sexist stereotypes out of our head and give women a fair run for leadership.
Trying to change the stereotypes about women is not only the business of women, but men have to be part of it.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
So we came here today, we met with all our lawyers,
We are going to file suit in Pennsylvania. It's a shame that we have to do that. It's the last thing that we wanted to do. It's the last thing my father wanted to do. But this is rampant corruption, and it can't happen. It simply can't happen. It's not fair. This isn't democracy.
So far, unfounded allegations coming from the Trump campaign. That was Eric Trump, President Trump's son, speaking in Philadelphia. From London and New York this morning. Good morning. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Bravitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Here's a snapshot of the market. I understand that yesterday was the biggest post-election pop on the S&P ever, up another 61. We had some weight to the S&P 500. We had a ton of weight to the NASDAQ over the last several days, up 1.8% on the S&P. And the FX market talked about that dollar weakness. Here we go again. Euro dollar out to 118.35 now, up 0.9% on that currency pair. Stronger euro, weaker dollar just bleeding through the FX market worldwide. And in the bond market, we just start to slow down that Treasury market rally. I think the story's really well understood now. Base case for so many people is that the fiscal package, if we get one, is not going to be as big if we do get one over the next several months. And as Lisa has pointed out repeatedly, Tom, in the last hour, the emphasis again, the pressure again, will be put on Chairman Powell and the Federal Reserve.
Well, it will be, because there isn't anything else going on, that's for sure. I just want to mention, John, that I thought the pop-off Van Buren in 1836 was really something. We digress to the Fed, where our phrase
you
today...
were there.
I was there.
Of course.
On radio and television, radio was there. Bloomberg Radio was there in 1836 as well. We digress with our phrase of the day, a neat narrative, which can only mean we go to Michael McKee for the neat narrative on his question, perhaps today, to the chairman. Michael, I have never seen a Fed meeting so ignored. I don't buy it. What could be the surprise this afternoon?
I'm maybe, something along the lines of Millard Fillmore taking a bath. That was the last time I saw you this excited about the White House. I don't know, Tom. There's not much the Fed could do. I mean, I suppose what they could do is to go ahead and offer some new forward guidance about how long they're going to keep rates low. But what's the point? You look at interest rates, the curve over the last 2 days has just plummeted. There's nothing for the Fed to do at this point, because they've got exactly what they want in terms of interest rates.
Well, Mike, what's so interesting here is the dichotomy between, the economy's doing okay, maybe we need stimulus, but little stimulus, and others looking at a partitioned America where things clearly are not okay. Can the Fed, or frankly fiscal, be surgical in their stimulus?
No, they can't. That's part of the problem. They can't really target. I mean, yes, in concept, they could target industries by buying their bonds, which they did to a certain extent with the secondary market purchase program. But they really don't want to be in the business of picking winners and losers. They can't do geographic. They can buy, if they want, mortgage, not mortgage. Well, they can buy mortgage bonds, but municipals. But at this point, there's nothing for them to do. I think Bill Dudley said it best last week when he said the Fed's out of ammunition. It's a case I've been making for quite some time. They raise and lower interest rates. Interest rates are as low as they can go almost, and there's not going to be much bang for the buck to push them even lower. You can go to zero, but it isn't going to encourage any more car sales or home sales.
Mike, financial conditions are super loose, as you've pointed out. Treasury yields have come in, the equity market is rallying, the dollar is weaker. If you ask the Fed what they wanted, this is the picture of the market they want, I would assume, Mike. Tight credit spreads, a high equity market, and a weak US dollar. Mike, the question we need to ask is whether we actually need more stimulus, not from the Fed, but on the fiscal side. What are you seeing in the economic data, Mike? And just breathe some life into the ISM we had that was pretty much ignored yesterday on the services side.
Yeah, the services ISM came down compared with the manufacturing when it went up, and it just shows we've seen a little bit of a slowing, and companies don't see the environment as good as it was. It's still relatively strong in the United States, and we haven't started any lockdowns like they have in Europe, but it may be coming. We also kind of ignored yesterday was the news that we had over 100,000 COVID cases yesterday, first time that we've gotten to that level. And if that keeps up, obviously you're going to have more things closed down. It's also almost wintertime, getting a little bit of an Indian summer here in New York and the Northeast the next couple of days. But after that, it gets cold and nobody's going to want to sit outside at these restaurants. So there's more pain ahead, and you can see that in the forecasts for a lot of economic data, particularly for jobs. Very low numbers anticipated, only about 350,000 or so for this Friday. And if that's the case, we're going to see more pain out there that really only Congress can deal with. And it's an open question right now how much they can actually provide. But I would expect Jay Powell to ask for it.
Michael McKee, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated this morning. Right now, in too short of time, Daniel Tokaji joins us with the University of Wisconsin. He is definitive on election law. Dean Tokaji, thank you so much for joining us. Because of the constrained time, I have one question. Within your basic textbooks on election law, what is the thing that matters right now?
Well, the thing that matters most is that the process that is going on in several states be allowed to continue to its conclusion, and that includes the counting of ballots in accordance with state law, the canvassing of results in accordance with state law, and to the extent permitted by state law, any recounts of ballots that might be conducted. That process is going on in many states, including the ones that are still contested in the presidential election, Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. There are some calls that the process be stopped, but I think what's most important is that the rule of law be adhered to, and that ballots be counted and, if appropriate, recounted in accordance with the law.
Dean, it's going to be too short a visit this morning. We hope to get you on in the coming days. Dean Tokaji with us from the University of Wisconsin Law School. We really want to have a longer conversation with him, but the news flow right now is absolutely extraordinary. John, we can recapitulate the markets, but we've missed is there's absolutely one news flow this morning on presidential vote count, and that is a narrowing gap in Georgia where Mr. Biden is not there yet, but he has shrunk that gap in Atlanta, in Fulton County.
Well, I think as Lisa and others and Mike Schumacher moments ago have pointed out, Tom, there's still a narrow path for a whole range of things to happen here, including the Democrats taking the Senate. Now, I understand that's a really narrow path still, Tom, but that's still on the table, just about. There's also a very narrow path for the president to take the White House. So there's all to play for here as this counting continues. We are focused on a handful of states, but the one that I think we keep bringing up, Tom, for good reason, is Arizona. And Lisa, you asked the question on this about 30 minutes ago on Arizona, and I think it's really, really important. Depending on what network you tune into, you will either see 264 or 253, depending on whether they have called Arizona.
Yeah, and if you look at it, it's about 88% of the vote has been counted. And the absentee ballots, the mail-in ballots, unclear whether they'll skew as much to the Democratic side as they have in the past. The big question, John, we're also watching.
This market has called its decision. Equities up, dollar down, dollar weaker in a big way. Bloomberg Dollar Index down by 0.8 of 1%. From London and New York this morning, good morning. A beautiful New York City.
It is.
With equities up, the dollar weaker. This is Bloomberg.
esta manera me gustaría decirle a los empleadores que fueran más humanitarios con sus trabajadores, que les hagan valer sus derechos.
Y estábamos viviendo en dos casas, en unas 50 personas y en la otra otras 50. En cada casa había 5 habitaciones. En cada habitación había de 3 a 4 camas abarrotadas. Vivíamos de 6 a 7 personas. Un baño para cada habitación y una cocina para todas.
Una vez que nos atendieron en el hospital, al salir nos avisó una compañera que ya nos habían reportado a migración.
Gracias a Dios ahorita de salud yo estoy muy bien, pero en lo moral no estoy muy bien, porque a causa de esa enfermedad yo perdí todo, perdí mi trabajo.
Yo creo que mi caso resulta un gran problema de cómo las personas migrantes estamos en riesgo de explotación por parte de los empleadores.
Do you think you'll have to produce less beer in 2021?
No, I don't think so. I think consumers will find a way. But I mean, if there are restrictions, but consumers, of course, are smart and they'll learn to live with those restrictions, I think some occasions will migrate.
Mercedes-Benz is on a path towards CO2 neutral mobility. So we have flicked the switch there, and really we're going to step by step electrify everything. And what does that mean? Combustion engines get electrified.
Or the Chancellor's own time.
We explore the trends, investments and competition of the European ETF industry. Join us on Bloomberg ETF IQ Europe.
Welcome to That's Debatable, an interactive series on today's most pressing issues. The resolution this time, is a U.S.-China space race good for humanity? We'll hear from both sides.
The competition, if you look at the past, led to innovation.
A whole new arms race could start. And we'll get your perspective, too, with help from the artificial intelligence of IBM Watson. I'm John Donvan. Join us for That's Debatable, presented by Bloomberg and Intelligence Squared, Friday on Bloomberg Television.
Patience is the real key here, and what the market wants to see is something that is orderly.
We could be still living in this uncertain environment around the stimulus for a while.
The biggest downside risk is that we get divided government and gridlock.
The Senate is even more important. That's where fiscal stimulus comes into play. That's where taxes come into play.
The consumer is very nervous.
The longer the uncertainty, the more the stimulus talk is going to be delayed. People are going to worry about growth again.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Good morning, everyone. This historic day for America. Jonathan Farrow, Lisa Abramowitz, and Tom Keene on Bloomberg Radio, on Bloomberg Television, and within the perfect Indian summer of New York, we see a nation counting every vote. There are 71,962,000 votes for Mr. Biden. The gap is 2.5%. But what we know within the counting of votes is the news flow bouncing off of this political moment. John, I got 8 ways to go in this opening, and I'm going to go, John Farrow, where you've been, which is the renminbi just moving to new strength moments ago.
Dollar weakness has got to be the story, Tom Keene. We've talked about this through the morning. The counting continues this close. This race is too close to call for so many people still. This market, though, is in the business of anticipating events. And the event they're anticipating is a Joe Biden White House and what that means for foreign policy, the global economy, and these currencies. And they're assuming, market participants are, it will mean a weaker dollar. And that's what you've got on the screen, Tom, not just against the Chinese currency, but it is broad-based and through the whole of G10.
John, the emotion in the United Kingdom, I saw the 5-letter word March and my heart skipped a beat. What are the ramifications of the United Kingdom extending a lockdown out 3 additional months?
Well, the lockdown goes through to early December. I know very few people who think it ends there. The additional complexity here, Tom, is the overlay of the Brexit decision. The UK is set to end that transition period at the end of December, Tom. The negotiations continue. So I wonder how much it is one part the story over a lockdown and another part the story over Brexit. Now, let's avoid the whole Brexit discussion at the moment. What I think is really important for a global audience right now is that what the UK managed to engineer this morning was the Chancellor coming out just after the Bank of England had expanded QE. And as I mentioned about 40 minutes ago on this programme, Chairman Powell wishes that he could come out today, say, sure, I do a little bit more QE, you go out and issue some more debt, provide some fiscal support. That's not going to happen, Tom, and it's not going to happen anytime soon.
I looked, Lisa Abramowitz, at the wall of news this morning, and just to synthesize it, an open question. What are you observing in election 2020?
I am observing conviction in markets where there isn't as much conviction among the numbers, both in the election and the ramifications therein. And this, to me, is a big question. Mike Schumacher, just on of Wells Fargo, he was talking about how he thinks that perhaps the reflation trade was overpriced and now it's underpriced. Even if we get what people are assuming that we're going to get, which is Joe Biden winning the presidency in a split Congress, will that necessarily mean what people think it will, given the fact that the virus is spreading in some places in the U.S. at a record pace, Tom?
Very good. And the headlines out moments ago. We've got to extend this before we get to Mr. Cirilli. John, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, it's just simple. He says this is not sustainable.
Is it sustainable? Is it not sustainable? Let's take a look at the gilt market right now, Tom. Yields on a 10-year, 21 basis points in the United Kingdom. What's sustainable in a world of rates where they are right now, Tom? And what's unsustainable? Now, I understand that typically we talk about this and we'd say it's unsustainable. We'd all say, yes, 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 it's totally unsustainable. The issue I've got right now, Tom, is that it has been sustainable for pretty much the whole of this year to do what this government has been doing, which has been subsidising wages up to about £2,500 a month, at 80% of that, capped at £2,500. Yet still, this gilt market hasn't done much. And Tom, here's the issue for me. Sovereign debt responds to the cycle, to inflation, to expectations over inflation, growth, rates. That's what sovereign debt responds to. For developed markets, now, so long as these bond markets behave like developed markets, then it's a sustainable position. I think that's the conversation that I would be having with Chancellor Sunak. What do you mean by unsustainable? Now, if you mean from some kind of moral standpoint, some kind of ideological standpoint as a conservative politician that you think this path is unsustainable for the next 6 to 9 months because you don't think people should be dependent on the government in this way, sure, lots of people will agree with you. But for the moment, Tom, it has been sustainable, and I imagine it will be into New Year too.
Well, we're going to do here because of schedules. And John, I just totally agree. And Kenneth Rogoff of Harvard was heated this morning on the need to continue to provide stimulus in America. We're going to have Kevin Cirilli with us. He's buried in the election details right now. We've got reporters at the Biden camp in Philadelphia and Arizona as well. But right now, Eric Friedman joins with U.S. Bank Wealth Management, their chief investment officer. Eric, you write acute notes of the moment. How do you take this news cacophony and create any form of long-term perspective?
Tom, I think the most important thing is to compartmentalize the issues in front of us. We really think there are 4 things in front of us. Number 1, the election event risk, which we're talking about right now. Number 2 is the pre-vaccine and likely COVID spread to follow. And then we have Inauguration Day. No matter who is going to be the sitting president, we have that agenda we have to digest. And then we actually have the event risk of the vaccine. So bottom line for us is that you have to really compartmentalize those 4 time periods and then think about what does life look like in a steady state after all this is behind us. So that leads us, Tom, to think about our positioning. And I think that there have been a lot of changes in the last 48, 72 hours that have really caused us to rethink what we're doing for clients right now.
All right, Eric, how are you changing your portfolios, or at least thinking of doing so, in the wake of what we just saw this week?
You know, the biggest thing, Lisa, is number 1, and you've been all over it this morning, is the effect on the dollar. And if you look at, for example, DXY or renminbi or the various charts you've been referring to this morning, there is a literal trapdoor at DXY 92.5 down to 88, which we haven't seen since the early part of 2018. If that happens, we frankly don't own enough international equities. And if you look at where we are in EM, To Jonathan's point from earlier this morning, EM has a great fundamental story. That data is getting better. That data is getting better on our metrics as well. So that for us is probably a higher conviction idea. But the lower conviction idea that we may get bullied into thinking about even further is, what about Europe and Japan? Those fundamental stories are not great. COVID, as well as demographics and economic activity, not great. But if we see both intervention and if we see a Biden presidency that does reach out to the other side, that could be bullish for Europe and Japan.
The yen crushed moments ago. Strong yen, 103.64. And John, this is the most intelligent thing I've heard on markets in the last 2 days. Do we own enough international?
It's a huge question, but Eric, we've got to get our hands around why we're seeing this dollar weakness before we get to the next step of trying to understand whether we should buy international. My interpretation of things at the moment, Eric, isn't just a position squeeze. It's that people think we do get a Biden White House, and they think it's a more predictable, softer foreign policy around trade and China and all that good stuff. Now, Eric, I just wonder how much that will influence the US dollar without really thinking about what the global cycle more broadly is going to look like into 21.
Yeah, I think that nails it, Jonathan. The other consideration I'd throw into the mix is, what does this mean for QE, both in terms of timing as well as size? And you mentioned that Chair Powell may have a real desire to be more forceful today, but he really can't be as we're still thinking about how these events unfold. So I think that there was a significant concession yesterday by Mitch McConnell when he said that we should come back to the table before too long, before year end, and that is a concession. But that also may mean just less. Maybe it's quicker stimulus, but actually may just be less on a gross basis. So those are things that we think will have more of a negative impact on the dollar. But again, if we come back to the long term, the steady state that we're thinking about after all this short term risk, we still think that U.S. productivity is better than the European and Japanese stories. So again, it could be more of a trade or a rental as opposed to a long-term strategic buy from us. So those are the things we're pondering in our investment committee right now.
Well, let's talk about what's happening in the FX market just briefly on my screen. Through G10, the dollar weaker against everything. Through EM, weaker against pretty much everything. The Turkish lira unchanged. Even the Turkish lira is unchanged on the morning. That tells you a lot about things at the moment if you've been following this FX market. Eric, my question to you then, when do you make the decision? You just said you're all having that conversation internally. There's some people itching right now, looking at the price action, thinking, I'm missing out. I've got to chase this. When do you make that call?
I think there's probably two big considerations, Jonathan. Number one is you have to think about your end size. So if we were to really take an overweight equity position and build into it over time, if we're going to go to 600-800 basis points over our benchmark, doing so right now may be a worthwhile conversation. Again, we know that or we shouldn't say we know, but we think that there's a likelihood of more COVID spread, more risk, and of course our hearts are with those impacted by that. And so that is going to be a headline negative. But our market's looking through that. The other thing to really think about in terms of that next leg into this trade is, when will the vaccine arrive? That is an estimate or a forecast that keeps being pushed out further into 2021. So I think that piecing into it in tranches, and I think that thinking about that right now makes some sense, but not feeling you have to be bullied into buying breakouts right now to get to a full position. That's the way that we're thinking about it right now.
Eric, just tremendous allowing us into the conversation this morning. We appreciate it. Eric Friedman, U.S. Bank Wealth Management Chief Investment Officer. Lisa, it goes back to something you touched on an hour or so ago, just the sequencing here. You've got to compartmentalize different things and just work through the sequencing. We've got to get through this risk event, still working through it, still counting. After that, you've got to get to the pre-vaccine, post-vaccine period over the next several months, if it is indeed several months. Then after that, the next move.
Yeah, but I think your comment to Eric was right. I'm really grateful to get inside their heads and inside some of those conversations, the idea that this was a pivotal election, a pivotal moment, and people are still processing the implications, not yet necessarily ready to make the move and pull the trigger.
Let's whip through this price action then this Thursday morning. Good morning to you all. The counting does continue. This market is making its move. That does not mean we have got a call to make on this White House or on Congress either. Equity futures are up 1.84%. We advanced 63 points. In the FX market, the euro is stronger. Pretty much everything is against the US dollar today. Euro dollar 118.50. And in the bond market, 0.76% is your yield. I'll do what Tom Keene didn't do a little bit earlier.
Bitcoin?
Happy birthday to the wonderful Mrs. Keene. Happy birthday. Equity futures up. This is Bloomberg.
With the First Word News, I'm Ritika Gupta. Joe Biden is just one battleground state away from becoming the next president of the United States. Biden already won 2 key prizes in the Midwest, the states of Michigan and Wisconsin. That puts him at just 6 electoral college votes away from the 270 that he needs. His best chance appears to be in Nevada, where he holds a lead over President Trump. For the president to be re-elected, he would have to win all the battleground states that haven't yet been called. President Trump's team is pursuing a contradictory legal strategy. The president is trying to stop vote counting in states where he's ahead, but he is demanding counting or recounting where he's losing to Biden. The president has repeatedly claimed that there's widespread fraud in voting by mail. And new lockdown restrictions take effect in England today. They'll enforce the closing of pubs, gyms and non-essential shops. Household mixing also will be restricted. Parliament gave its blessing to the new rules after Prime Minister Boris Johnson warned that England faces the, quote, risk of mortality on a grievous scale. That record-setting $35 billion IPO by Ant Group reportedly will be delayed by at least 6 months. That's according to the Financial Times, and was supposed to begin listing its shares in Hong Kong and Shanghai today. But earlier this week, Chinese regulators put that offering on hold. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Best, your weekly review of the most important business news, analysis, and interviews from Bloomberg Television around the world.
Ken Burns, welcome to Bloomberg Big Decisions.
We have always been a mixture of things. We are always stronger for that mixture.
Growth is a way to stay competitive, delight more and more consumers.
Welcome to the Best of Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang.
They've moved the needle by acknowledging that they have to monitor the content.
What is one word of advice you'll take with you?
Learn how to listen. And that is certainly something that has served me well.
Ankiti, where do you go from here? It's a huge market. It's a huge opportunity. I want to go 100x from here.
Our philosophy is to partner where we can and stand apart when we should.
What is happening today in India is actually a determination
to rebuild our economy.
India has an opportunity not only competing in the space of the factory of the world, but a very big opportunity to compete in being the office of the world.
Market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
Every vote must be counted. No one's going to take our democracy away from us. Not now, not ever. America's come too far. America's fought too many battles. America's endured too much.
Former Vice President Joe Biden there weighing in on the vote as the counting continues. For our audience worldwide, good morning to you all. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Bravitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. 1 hour and 12 minutes away from the opening bell. Let's get into the price action just very, very briefly. In the equity market, a tidy rally over the last few days, a huge rally on the NASDAQ. The S&P 500 up 64. We add another 1.85% to the S&P. That sell-off in the US dollar, just as this session grows older, that sell-off gets bigger and bigger. Euro dollar 118.46. We are positive there 1 percentage point. That is a stronger euro. Will the president join a very lonely post-war club with Ford, Carter, Bush Sr., Tom Keene, incumbent presidents that did not get that next term come election day? The counting continues. The political pundits, I've got to say, they have had a huge, huge dose of humility. You've got to think about what they've had to swallow after staring at polls for the last 2 months, Tom, that said this would be a wipeout at one point. They don't want to call this. No one wants to call this because the votes are still being counted. This market, though, Tom, is making its move in a big way.
Yeah, the market is voting right now. There's no question about that. I would point out yen, absolutely stunning over 2 standard deviation moves. Strong yen, well under 104, 103.71. It is rare that you see that. We've seen too much of him. Our Kevin Cirilli joins us now, our chief Washington correspondent. Kevin, there's Georgia. We could talk about Georgia. I'll give you an open call here. What state are you focused on now?
Well, in the short term, let's just go through the TikTok. At 10:30 Eastern time, New York time, we're going to hear an update from Georgia's Secretary of State with the latest round of additional votes that come in. So that's in just more than 2 hours when we should get additional votes count, or at least an update on the timeline of Georgia and the battleground state. Then at about noon Eastern, we're going to hear from Clark County, Nevada. Of course, that's where Las Vegas is. The overwhelming majority of votes in the battleground state of Nevada. That's going to really still potentially push Joe Biden to the magic number of 270 in the Electoral College count. But then this evening, 9 p.m. Eastern, and this is where it gets interesting, is when you're going to have Arizona provide a final update with regards to Maricopa County. Now, the Trump campaign has been saying that they feel that Arizona could potentially still go their way, but we'll know. We'll have a lot more clarity, I should say, by 10 o'clock New York time tonight, once all of this data comes in.
Kevin, one of the reasons why you're so great is you walk the halls of Capitol Hill and people say, Kev, what's going on? And you say to them, what do you really think of this election and the result? For the Republican strategists that you speak with who say, hey, Kev, are they saying, all right, you know what? Trump has lost, Biden has won? Or are they still saying, you know what? President Trump is right, and some of these states could be battlegrounds, including Arizona?
And I want to be careful here because there are definitely still a large number of Republicans that I speak with who are very much forcefully fighting with the president, whether it's Eric Trump and Rudy Giuliani yesterday in Philadelphia. But that said, I did yesterday speak with one source who works in the halls of Congress, as you just alluded to, who told me that there is a palpable frustration with how the president communicated on election night with regards to, and in the hours that followed, followed in claiming certain victories that, quite frankly, the results have not been finalized. They have not come in yet, and there's a frustration on that. Meanwhile, with that frustration, there's also an excitement about the potential of midterm elections in 2022, and also about the strong night that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell had in terms of defending seats with Senator Joni Ernst, Senator Susan Collins, and Senator Lindsey Graham, three that immediately come to mind, in which there had been questions about whether or not they would. I thought Kevin McCarthy, who is the leader, of course, of the Republicans in the House of Representatives, noting about the 7 or so seats as of now that Republicans picked up in what will still be a Democratic majority in the House, but expanding their gains and diversifying in terms of the Republican caucus with the addition of several women as well as minorities in the House of Representatives. There's this sense of there has to be patience and waiting in terms of what happens with the presidency, but there's also this sense of it was not the blue wave that could have been for Democrats. And there's still a narrow path to that happening, but there wasn't this massive blue wave tsunami of sorts in Congress,
well,
Lisa.
It'll be much to talk about in the coming days. Right now, we've got to continue counting votes. Kevin Cirilli, thank you so much. Our Chief Washington correspondent. This is a joy. Rick Mishkin joins us now. Frederick Mishkin of Columbia University, the former Federal Reserve governor. And we can wax philosophical about the Fed, about our central bank. Forget about that. Let's wax philosophical about his wonderful textbooks on policy. He has thought more than anyone I know about policy and linking it into the American good. Rick Mishkin, does Mr. Biden run a traditional Democratic Party, Democratic president policy, or does he have to carve a new path if he's elected?
Who knows? It's so complicated, and that what's happened has been a real polarization, not just in terms of Americans, but with the parties themselves. So we've seen the right in the Republican Party go to quite extreme positions, and we've seen the left in the Democratic Party do the same thing. And Biden is a centrist, but it's going to be very complicated, and particularly that the Senate will almost surely be a Republican Senate. So getting anything done is going to be very difficult. I do think that there will be some stimulus that will be put in place because it's really clear cut, I think, from both parties that something needs to be done. But it certainly won't be what the Democrats would have liked if, in fact, there was a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president, because there's certainly not going to be the kind of money going to the states that the Democrats initially wanted. So it's a very complicated environment for him. I think it's going to be very tough for Biden, who's, I don't necessarily think that he's a super strong person. He's got a tough job to do, and of course it's not absolutely sure that he's going to win the election, but it looks increasingly likely.
The counting continues. He has his nose in front just about at the moment, Rick. The choreography this morning in the United Kingdom was phenomenal. The Bank of England makes its call, pulls the decision early. The Chancellor of the Treasury follows up. They work hand in glove, almost perfectly, over the last several hours. Rick, do you assume that the Federal Reserve and the person leading that institution is going to be much, much closer to the president, and whoever that president might be, not just through the next 4 years, but over the next several decades?
Well, I think that there's clearly an issue in terms of the relationship between Jay Powell and Donald Trump was not good at all. We've never seen quite the vociferous attacks that we've seen from President Trump. In fact, mentioned my textbook, in my new edition coming out, I have a whole new section on presidential attacks on the Fed and how unique these are. There have always been some attacks, but these are really very unique. So I think certainly that if Joe Biden is elected, that the relationship between the Fed and the president will be much better than it will be been before. In fact, I think that Joe Biden will just leave the Fed alone and let it do its job. Now, in practice, it really hasn't influenced very much what the Fed's done, the criticisms of Donald Trump. But it does politicize the Fed. So hopefully there'll be a little less politicization of the Fed. I think that would be a good thing. But we'll have to wait and see. I think the Fed has a very tough job right now. They basically are out of tools. The action really has to come from federal government spending, and that's something the Fed can't control. They clearly want more expansionary policy from the federal government. but who knows exactly how much that will be.
Well, when you say that they're basically out of tools, Professor Mishkin, this is really important. A lot of people are saying they are out of tools, but it doesn't mean they're not going to act further, whether it's expanding the balance sheet or playing around with other ways of stimulating the economy. Do you expect them to double down on their existing policies, even if they are not proving to be effective in actually stimulating economic growth?
Well, it's a key issue is what do you mean by effective? That you're supposed to do what you can to help. It's just that you have to be aware that the tools are not sufficient at this point. This is one of the problems that occurs when we hit what we call the zero lower bound or effective lower bound on policy rates. You can't go much below zero. In fact, countries that have tried to go below zero, it's not at all clear that that actually even helps. So the Fed has an issue. It can do things through its asset purchases and its lending. In fact, I thought that the Fed performed brilliantly in the early phase of the coronavirus pandemic, but to make sure that we didn't have another depression. To be honest, that things were very scary right then. Luckily, the Fed had basically done war games by actually figuring out what to do. It took them about 18 months in total to do everything during the global financial crisis. They were able to basically do it in 2 weeks. So that was very helpful. But all that could do is stabilize the situation. Getting the economy to bounce back when the coronavirus seems to be getting worse. I mean, my view is right now what's happening in the economy, it's all about the coronavirus pandemic. Clearly, we have not handled this particularly well. And it has actually, we're now at record level cases. I think it's going to get much worse in the winter. Just think about people getting together at Thanksgiving and then not being able to go outside when it gets really cold. I think it's going to be pretty grim, and that's going to be a real problem for the economy. And the Fed basically is going to do what it has to do, but on the other hand, it can't solve the problem, and that's why we actually need action from the federal government.
Rick, we would love to get you back on the programme soon. We appreciate your time this morning, sir. Frederick Mishkin there, formerly of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. If you're just tuning in, here's the state of play. In about a minute or so, we will get initial jobless claims in the United States of America. The counting does continue. If you're following the Electoral College votes, what we're calling at the moment from the Associated Press, and it's very, very clear on that we're following the Associated Press here, 264 to 214. What you might see elsewhere is 253 to 214 because they're taking off those 11 Electoral College votes from Arizona, which some people still think is too close to call still, Tom. So a handful of states in the mix at the moment that are still very, very too close to call, and a lot of ballots still to count through. So the counting will continue. The counting will continue. But this market, as you said, Tom, is voting. This market is voting and has been voting for the last several days now, and assuming that we will have a Biden White House.
It's a correlated voting. Look at renminbi out to new strength just moments ago, 6.6063. John, I've never seen a move in China like that.
Let's get to the price action. 20 seconds out from that initial jobless claims data in the United States of America. Here's the scene for you. Up 61 on the S&P. We advanced 1.8%. The outperformance coming from big tech. The NASDAQ flying. The dollar dying. Euro dollar 118.37, a weaker US dollar. And in the bond market, yields unchanged, 0.7562%. That's the price action. Here's the data. Claims out on time. Here's Michael McKee.
We're just getting the numbers in now. 751,000 in terms of jobless claims, 7,285,000 in terms of continuing claims. At this point, it doesn't look like we're seeing a significant improvement. The 751 matches what we saw last week, although we're waiting to see, and I probably have this right in front of me here, in terms of what we saw last week. Yeah, last week was revised up to 758. So a minor change in terms of the revision lower, but we're still holding in that mid 700s range, which suggests that we are still seeing some problems. A lot of states have worked to correct any kind of misfilings, fraudulent filings, and errors, and we're not seeing things fall. The continuing claims do fall a little bit, but it looks like what's happening there is people are just using up their 26 weeks of benefits and moving on to the pandemic emergency program. That rose by 277,000. So at this point, we're still seeing jobless claims suggest the economy has slowed.
Michael McKee, we're going to see productivity as well. Buried in those many ratios is unit unit labor costs? What does it say about the wage dynamics of America?
Well, it's kind of hard to get a clear reading on it, Tom, in the sense that we're seeing people who make less drop out of payrolls and people who make more remain paid. So we haven't gotten the numbers yet from the Commerce Department, but the labor costs should rise a little bit because of that dynamic. If we're losing more waiters and waitresses and holding on to more architects, we'll see higher unit labor costs, but it doesn't really mean a lot because at this point, costs are still very low for American companies.
Can you just build on that, Mike, in terms of the trend that we've seen? When we look at these jobless filings, some people say, haven't we run out of people to file for jobless claims at this point? Are these the individuals being cut by, say, Boeing or Exxon, some of these industrial companies that are making cost cuts versus the waiters and waitresses out there trying to survive in an era where you cannot go to a restaurant?
Yeah, I imagine it's a mix of both, Lisa. At this point, you're seeing a lot of big companies that announce layoffs. Those usually sort of take place over a period of time, and we're kind of getting into that. The airlines went through it a couple of weeks ago. But we're still seeing, you just walk around New York City, you can see the restaurants that were open a couple weeks ago closing up. And a lot of people are warning this is happening all over the country because people are coming back and finding their business isn't viable now. So the question is, when does that stop? When do you finally get to an equilibrium point? Obviously, we're not there yet.
Michael McKee, thank you so much. And of course, Mr. McKee, very much focused on the Fed meeting this afternoon. We would hope that he will have a terse question for the chairman of the Federal Reserve System. Always with questions for the Fed is Peter Hooper. He is with Deutsche Bank and their global head of economic research. What a thrill to speak on one day to David Folkerts-Landau and now to his colleague, Dr. Hooper. Peter Hooper, there is so much to talk about, but I need to immediately go to the cautious view Deutsche Bank has had on the American economy. Do you reaffirm that within this political moment?
Yes, Tom. Near term, certainly things are starting to slow. We had a very good September, but the data for October have begun to soften. And what we're seeing in the labor market right now, I think agrees with that. This morning's number certainly in line with the sense that the labor market is not improving further. ADP number yesterday, 365, says we may get some downward surprise, downward drift in payroll gains on Friday as well. So our sense is the economy is slowing to noticeably below the consensus expectation. Consensus still around something like 3.5%, 4% growth in the fourth quarter. We'd put it a bit under 1%, perhaps, given what we're seeing now as some slowing in consumer spending. We had a drop off in auto sales. Some high frequency numbers on apparel purchases, also pointing in this direction. What's happening here is that the drop in support, the unemployment benefit, the extra unemployment benefits came off in October. Household income growth has slowed substantially. I think households are starting to take it out of savings. So yes, we do think the economy is slowing near term, and the election results certainly at this point have taken out the upside risk on substantial fiscal stimulus next year.
Peter, what is the nature of gridlock right now? When you talk to Matt Lazzetti about an American Deutsche Bank view, does a gridlock get us closer to stimulus salvation?
Gridlock getting a stimulus salvation. I suppose it depends on your point of view, but certainly we're not going to be getting anything like the $4 trillion packages that people were dreaming about under a blue wave. Mitch McConnell came out yesterday, said we have to put high priority in getting something done before the end of the year. The Republican Senate had been talking about a $500 billion support package. I think it's with the election results we're seeing at this point. My sense is, and with a if the things turn out the way they seem to be leaning right now, if Biden is president, a president that's going to be trying to do something to bring the country together, to get something done here. Yes, you have a gridlock. You have a Republican Senate and a Democratic House with a Democratic administration, but you're going to have, I think, an effort to try to get things done. So I'm not quite as pessimistic as
Peter, still a lot of ifs. The counting continues. One thing we can look at is the economic data, the hard data, claims. We had the ISM out yesterday, services, the employment component. A little bit of sluggishness in the mix there, Peter. I just wonder from your perspective how you think the Federal Reserve, when they meet today, will actually pour through the jobs data we've seen in the last couple of weeks.
I think they'll be seeing an economy that's starting to slow. And this certainly tells you why Powell has been out front saying we need more fiscal stimulus at this juncture. It's an economy that's still hurting from the shock that it's faced, and the support coming off is going to be giving us a significant slowing of growth. It's not enough to get them to do anything today. I expect to see something. If the numbers come in the way we're anticipating, I wouldn't be surprised to see some action by the December meeting in terms of balance sheet, increasing the maturity of purchases, this sort of thing.
Wait, let's build on that, Peter. How much do you expect the Fed to potentially expand their balance sheet if there is no promise of fiscal support? On balance sheet, the first thing I expect is increasing the maturity of their purchases. On actually expanding from the pace of 120 billion per month, they told us that they would continue at least that pace. So certainly, if the economy is slowing, we could see some pickup on that. How much we haven't made a forecast on that yet, but wouldn't be surprised to see something. If we don't get any more fiscal support before the end of the year, if the economy is slowing to well below current expectations, yes, I think the Fed steps in and begins to do something there. All right, so how big is the spread between the street's expectation currently of growth in the U.S. versus Deutsche Bank's house view of growth, given where we are politically, given where we are with the virus? Okay, our current forecast is in the range of 0.5% for annual rate of growth in the fourth quarter. I think the latest Bloomberg survey that I've seen is in the neighborhood of 3.5% to 4%. So well above the numbers we're putting in there. We do see growth picking up next year to between 3.5% and 4%, even without the extra. We had viewed the possibility of a large stimulus package next year as an upside risk to our baseline forecast. At this point, we're looking at something in the half $500 billion to $1 trillion range of fiscal stimulus next year, which supports that growth picking up into the 3.5–4% range, along with the assumption that we will get relief through vaccination and better testing.
Peter Hooper, great to catch up with you, sir. Thank you. Deutsche Bank head of Global Economic Research. Getting a headline in the last couple of minutes, Tom. Can't bring you much context around it, but the Trump campaign is to make a major announcement in Las Vegas. A major announcement in Las Vegas, Tom.
Well, we've just got some details in on this. This is a Bloomberg headline. We're going to go with it, folks. I mean, it's a movable feast. What's important here, John, is the Donald J. Trump for President, Inc. So this is not the president that will hold a press conference in Las Vegas, but the people around them. And you just wonder where it will go. And it's the beginning of this contentious process, isn't it? And right now I'm looking at the vote count, and I don't see any amendments. And, you know, John, we're looking at 8:45 East Coast time. So pretty soon it should click in, surely looking into the 10 o'clock hour.
Yeah, that news conference will be alongside the former Director of National Intelligence, Rick Rennell, the former Nevada Attorney General, Adam Laxalt, the Chairman of the American Conservative Union, Matt Schlapp, and the Nevada GOP Chair, Michael McDonald. I think, Tom, you can almost guess the direction of that particular news conference as the counting continues. And the counting does continue, and we don't have results in several key states. And, Tom, there are some issues around states that have been called that some people still think are too close to call. And the state we keep coming back to is Arizona. It's the difference between Vice President Joe Biden being on 264 or 253. The Associated Press called that yesterday. Fox News called it very early on. And the campaign and the president himself was said to be very upset with that decision. And it's still in the mix at the moment this morning, Tom.
68,000 gap. And, of course, the gap's a difference with the percentage of the vote, the size of the vote. Nevada, off the top of my head, is a 1/3 smaller vote than Arizona. And, John, the gap in, Nevada, the gap is 7,000 votes roughly. So that'll be really interesting to see how that moves.
The Associated Press has it 264 to 214, and perhaps we get several key states finishing their counting. That counting continues for the next 24 hours. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Bravitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Here's the price action. What a rally we've seen over this week. Tuesday night, lasting a lifetime. That's how we open the show. That's how we start to close the show. Futures up 61, up 1.8% on the S&P 500. Euro dollar 118.34. We have a weaker dollar, substantially weaker dollar. And in the bond market, bonds bid over the last couple of days in a big way. Your yield 0.75% from London and New York. This is Bloomberg.
With the First Word News, I'm Rishika Gupta. Joe Biden is on the brink of taking the White House after wins in Michigan and Wisconsin. Biden now is 6 electoral college votes shy of the 270 that he needs to win. His best chance may be in Nevada, where he holds a lead over President Trump. The president's campaign is suing in Michigan and Pennsylvania to stop vote counts that have been trending towards Biden. The president could still be re-elected, but he would have to win all the battleground states that have not yet been called. Once all the votes are counted, it's still likely to be a divided U.S. Congress. In Portland, Oregon, hundreds of protesters angry about President Trump's challenges to the vote smashed windows at businesses. Governor Kate Brown declared it a riot, and she called up National Guard troops to help law enforcement handle the violence. And a grim milestone in the coronavirus pandemic. Daily deaths and new infections have set global records. Yesterday, it was reported that more than 10,000 people died from the disease, and the number of people reporting infections passed 600,000 in a day for the first time. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Rishika Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
When opportunity knocks at the door, don't say, blimey, I've still got my pajamas on. Say yes to stuff and it will take you interesting places.
We're clearly going through some very unusual times and, enormous difficulties getting groups of people to agree on things.
From Bloomberg's European headquarters in the City of London, join us on Leaders with Lacqua.
to win, for a Republican to win here, how many votes do we have to be ahead? 400,000 is not enough? With 80+% counted, I think there's only 14% of the vote to go. We're going to win this election. We've actually won it. Just a matter of counting the votes fairly.
Rudy Giuliani there, the personal lawyer to President Trump, speaking in Philadelphia. A uniform approach from the Trump campaign in the last 24 hours, continuing to insinuate something that is so far very much unfounded. From London and New York this morning, good morning. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Here's the price action. This market is confident about something. I think if you ask a political pundit right now, I don't think they've got much confidence about anything. Equities are rallying into the open once again. The Open, the program, just around the corner. I'll be catching up with Bob Michael of JP Morgan Investment Management. Tom, looking forward to that chat.
Very good. Well, it'll be interesting as well. And again, futures up 63. What is definitive is we are counting votes. We are counting votes in Wisconsin and in Michigan, and then on to the mysteries of this Thursday. As John Farrow says in election 2020, it is decidedly an extended Tuesday. Tuesday evening has never lasted so long, to steal from Mr. Farrow. Right now, we need to consider Michigan. We need to consider the state of the Michigan economy and the state of General Motors. And there is no one more qualified to do that than David Weston here with Ms. Barra. David?
Thank you so very much, Tom Keene. We now welcome the General Motors Chairman and CEO. She is Mary Barra. So, Mary, thank you for being with us. You have your earnings out just a short time ago. I think congratulations are in order. You exceeded expectations. People thought you'd come back. You'd come back more than people thought. Give us your perspective on what drove that. How much of that was General Motors and what you're doing at General Motors? How much of that was the economy and some of the massive stimulus that's gone into the pockets of Americans?
Well, thanks, David. It's great to be here. And, you know, really, when you look at one of the key reasons was the GM team members. They have done just a phenomenal job across all areas of our business, working and demonstrating their commitment to the business, also prioritizing safety and following our safety protocols. And that has been a key ingredient to driving this very successful quarter. I would also say it's on the strong demand for trucks. A couple of years ago, as we started to roll out our new full-size trucks, we talked about the fact that we were going to cover the whole market, both from a value perspective, but also from a feature perspective. That strategy is working out extremely well, and we see very high demand for our full-size pickups at all levels, but especially in those high-end pickups with the AT4, for example, with the GMC. We also continue to have very strong cost performance, not only the specific austerity measures that we took because of the pandemic, but also the work we'd already been doing as part of the transformation. And then finally, GMF performed extremely well. So all of that coming together, I think our products, the discipline of the team, and our focus on cost is what allowed us to have this strong quarter.
Yeah, Mary, as you say, I looked at your waterfall chart there carefully, and some of it was price and some of it was cost saving. So well done. You have it balanced. Let's talk about trucks. They clearly powered you. You've talked about them for some time now, your pickup trucks. Do you have enough of them? Can you produce enough? What are you seeing in demand?
We're seeing strong and growing demand. And right now, we're building every truck we can make. But I think very shortly, you'll hear us taking action to how we're going to further our capability to build more trucks, because what we see is the demand continues to grow. We think the shift to trucks, especially with the luxury trucks, the premium trucks that we're offering for both GMC and Chevrolet, that is going to be a continuing trend.
So, Mary, you talked about the safety of your colleagues at General Motors. Is the coronavirus at this point inhibiting at all your ability to produce enough product, enough trucks?
Well, you know, we've worked hand in hand not only with all of the GM team members, and I'm just so proud of the way everyone is following the safety protocols and staying safe, and I think they're even in many cases taking them home. Our employees tell us they feel safer at work than they do at a grocery store, and I think that speaks to what we're doing and their commitment to following the protocols that we jointly developed with the UAW and our peers across the industry. We've shared all that with the supply base, and that is allowing us to continue to to make sure we have the parts necessary. It's a very dynamic situation, and we just work to address each situation as it occurs. But right now, really pleased with how the team is being creative to keep our ability to build as many trucks as we can.
Mary, looking out into the future, you have been consistent in saying an important part of the GM strategy is electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. Give us a little bit of insight into that, particularly as we are now waiting for a result on the election. Does it make a material difference to your strategy whether we have a Democrat or a Republican in the White House? Because they have very different approaches to things like fossil fuels and green energy.
We are 100% committed to EVs, and we're working to accelerate our EV transformation. I think some of the examples of that are the GMC Hummer EV, the Cadillac Lyriq, and then the Bolt EV as well. We also just recently announced a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing commitment at Factory Zero in Detroit-Hamtramck, the Ultium Cell LLC in Lordstown, Ohio, and then just most recently at our Spring Hill Assembly Plant in Tennessee. So we've got the manufacturing capability, we have great vehicles, and we've got the expertise and the technology with Ultium. Speed is vitally important as well, and that's why we're working so quickly. So regardless of who wins the election, we're going to continue on a rapid pace to transform to EVs.
Mary, you mentioned the Hummer EV. A lot of people out there are excited about that Hummer EV. How many pre-orders have you got so far?
The demand has well exceeded our expectation. As you know, this is a very premium entry, so we're incredibly pleased at the strong demand, and we'll continue to monitor that as we go forward.
And so, Mary, it's not just electric vehicles, it's also fuel cell. You announced a deal with Nikola. As I understand it, there's a deadline on that deal in December. Where are you on that right now? Do you expect to go through with it? And will there be material changes in the terms of the deal?
So right now we are in ongoing discussions with Nikola regarding the transaction. The transaction has not closed, and so we'll provide further updates at the appropriate time. But I think what's important to note is our fuel cell technology, the Hydrotech hydrogen fuel cells that we've developed with Honda. They are industry leading, and that's from external sources. And so we're going to continue to look for ways to not only commercialize our fuel cells, but also the Ultium battery platform, because I think that continues to advance our zero-emission future.
Finally, Mary, briefly, do you expect a continued rebound in 2021? What are you looking at?
A lot depends on if we, across the globe, get the coronavirus under control, and we know what we need to do from a safety protocol perspective. So we're hopeful that we'll start to make some progress there. Obviously, in the United States, we're monitoring what will happen with additional stimulus. But if those factors if we get the virus under control and other elements stay on track, we think we can continue the recovery into 21, and definitely we believe we'll continue to see strong full-size truck demand.
Mary, it's always a great treat to get to talk to you. Thank you so much. That's Mary Barra. She's General Motors Chairman and CEO. Tom?
David Weston, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. We have new numbers from Georgia. These are important and an advantage to President Trump. This is a little bit of a blip, 1,600 votes for Mr. Trump added on and only 750 for Mr. Biden. So it's been Biden, Biden, Biden. There's good news for President Trump. Please stay with us through the day. This is Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television. Good morning.
think you'll have to produce less beer in 2021?
No, I don't think so. I think consumers will find a way. But I mean, if there are restrictions, but consumers, of course, they're smart and they'll learn to live with those restrictions, I think some occasions will migrate.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
From New York and London for our audience worldwide, good morning, good morning. The countdown to the Open starts right now. 30 minutes away from the opening bell with equities absolutely flying. We begin with a big issue. The counting continues this November 5th. Democratic nominee Joe Biden exuding confidence after flipping Wisconsin and Michigan.
After a long night of counting, it's clear that we're winning enough states to reach 270 electoral votes needed to win the presidency. I'm not here to declare that we've won, but I am here to report when the count is finished, we believe we will be the winners.
President Donald Trump seeking a recount in Wisconsin and filing lawsuits in Michigan, Pennsylvania and Georgia as his path to re-election continues narrowing. The former vice president closing in on 270, putting the White House within striking distance. The candidates now turning their attention to a handful of key states, including Arizona, Nevada, Georgia and Pennsylvania. Let's bring in the Bloomberg team, shall we? Kevin Cirilli and Sarah Ponzek join us now. Kevin, to start with you, sir, the difference between 264 and 253 is a big state called Arizona. Where are we?
And at 9 p.m. Eastern tonight, Jonathan, likely is when we're going to get some more data coming from Arizona. The Trump campaign says that they believe that once all the votes are counted in Arizona, that the decision that some networks have made to tally it for the Democrats will be reversed. But of course, if you look at the data in Maricopa County, that traditionally has leaned Democratic. Let's take a look at the timeline of today, because I think a lot of folks are wondering when specifically we will get the influx in data. And if you see at 10:30 a.m. Eastern time, Georgia's Secretary of State will hold a news conference as they begin to tally, continue to tally rather, some of their votes. Georgia has not yet been called, but that's in just under 90 minutes. We're anticipating that news conference from the battleground state of Georgia. Then noon New York time, Clark County, Nevada is going to give an update. Clark County is where Las Vegas is, where the overwhelming majority of votes cast in Nevada are tallied. And so that we'll find out some more clarity, some more data following noon. And then, of course, this evening, 9 p.m. Eastern, as I mentioned, is when we'll get some more data from Arizona. The bottom line, when I talk to sources on the president's re-election campaign, they feel that their path to 270 involves and includes winning Pennsylvania, winning Georgia, winning North Carolina, and getting that reverse decision in Arizona. In contrast to that, the Democrats truly believe that they are on the cusp, if not today, by tomorrow, of getting to the magic number of 270 in the Electoral College. Jonathan.
Kevin, the path to a second term in the White House might also include some lawsuits as well. We understand from reporting about 10, 20 minutes ago that the campaign will be making a major announcement in Las Vegas. We await that news conference in the next several hours. Kevin, what are you hearing from the campaign about their next steps in a state like Nevada?
Well, look, in order for the Trump campaign and for President Trump to get reelected, they have to pursue legal action. And they've been foreshadowing this for several weeks and months, really, to be quite frank with you. And so whether it was yesterday when the president's personal attorney, as well as the president's son, Eric Trump, and Rudy Giuliani appearing in Philadelphia, or this announcement that we're hearing in Nevada, if it's not a one-on-one state approach, then they will likely file a massive legal suit that would involve several states. I don't want to get ahead of this, though, because I